Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another Deepest Law reviewing Adam Curtis. I think it's the 42nd one. I kind of enjoyed our little trip to Italy in the 80s last week. Simon.
Yeah. It's quite sad in the end, quite bittersweet.
Now we're going to go to one of my favorite settings anywhere in history or anything.
You're just in it for the derelict, aren't you?
Well, literally just the grimmest, most depressing I guess you'd call it the, what do they call it? Like in America, they call it the Rust Belt, but
yeah,
it's kind of like
you could call it early UKification.
Yeah.
But it's basically like kind of at the very fag end of industry, when the British government knocked down all the lovely Victorian houses. Well, I say lovely, they were a bit decrepit, to be fair, but instead of like patching them up, they just knocked them all down and built just massive brutalist high-rise flats all around the country.
Yeah, the 60s system build flat and the dinge of that is kind of, it's sort of iconic of, as Horace says, a kind of early UKification in that period. I mean, in the 80s, probably the icon of UKification is probably an overturned shopping trolley in the middle of a canal or something like that. And now we have like whole new.
I know Morgoth did the thing on nostalgia recently, but like for some reason, I kind of, even though it's relentlessly grim, I kind of love it. And I've never. I mean, it kind of just reminds me. It reminds me of my own like growing up and going to public libraries built in Wales in the 60s, and they all had this certain, like, I don't know, it's just so fucking depressing.
Yeah.
I kind of like it in a way.
It always reminds me of like the early New Order stuff, after Joy Division kind of blew apart, and then New Order reformed themselves, and I always loved that feeling and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's funny. You mentioned like early 80s, that kind of era. That there was a short-lived band called Bronski Beats, I think they're called. Or Bronski.
Oh, don't act like you don't know who they are.
But they've got this one video where this guy, like, it's a little bit gay. So, but if you take out the gay,
it is. You're right there. It is a little bit gay.
So it's a lot gay, right? But if you take out the gay element and just see where, it just starts with him having breakfast, and his parents are there, and he's having some cornflakes, and he goes on the train, and he looks out.
Small town boy, probably, isn't it?
Small boy. That video. It's something about that aesthetic.
Yeah.
It's like Smith's front covers, and I don't know.
That's a little bit extra bleak as well, because isn't he from Scotland?
I noticed I didn't get invited on for the Italian village one, but I got invited on for the council estate brutalism.
Oh man.
Yeah.
So anyway, why don't we? I mean, I'll just remind everyone buy courses at Academic Agency, Trivium, etc. I'll just go around the panel, and you can let's do the shillings, and we'll get into this because there's quite a lot to get through. So, Morgoth, anything you want to draw people's attention to? Where can people find you, etc.?
Well, as always, a Substack. There's a couple of ones that I did. I did Deepest Law. That's my Deepest Law is classic movies with Endeavour, and I did a little clip segment. We did Once Upon a Time in America on Sunday. That's up on Endeavour's channel and on my Substack, where you can find everything that I do. So that's me.
Horace.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that review of Once Upon a Time in America. It's a horrible film. I'm on Substack. I think my link is below the video. It's eternalhorus.substack.com.
Yeah. And I'll do a retrospective shill. Go and listen to the review I did with Proper Horror Show on last week about Freud's essay on the uncanny, which is good fun.
Great. All right. Well, let's make a start. That film, Once Upon a Time in America, I remember it being brutal. I was into really, really into gangster films when I was a teenager, but that one, what do the kids say? It hit different. I didn't like that one for some reason. It just felt off to me. I always remember the rape scene. So anyway, let's get going on this. So Simon, correct me if I'm wrong, this was 1984.
Yeah, we're jumping slightly in terms of the order, so we could let Morgoth in on this week. And this is, again, one of that period where there's a bit of submerged Curtis coming out. It's in the sort of the interview technique, the choices, letting people become uncomfortable on camera. And the revelation is kind of in that. So it's still kind of reading between the lines. You don't have the authoritative Curtis narration. I think here it's a guy called David Jones. But again, there's an echo of the film we did on the seaside. I'm funny. Morgoth sent me a little film from the Pet Shop Boys about the seaside that they did. Do you remember that film, Morgoth? Because I've not seen it. I've not got.
Yeah, I did. It's called "It Couldn't Happen Here."
Yeah.
And this aesthetic that we're talking about, it's funny because nobody ever talks about that Pet Shop Boys. It's a full movie. I think it's about 90 minutes long. It's got Barbara Windsor in it. Josh Ackland is in it. Gareth Hunt is in it. And that would be worthy of a Deepest Law in and of itself because it's set in this really run-down, gloomy seaside town. And it's so pretentious and arty. And it's like Neil Tennant looks like he's just come out of like a posh restaurant. And he's got like a scarf around him. And then you get these weird scenes. So they're in this greasy spoon and everything's run down. The weather's shit and grey. It's just bleak. It looks like sort of like Blackpool in January or something. That's it. And then you get these weird sort of archetypes of post-war English history. And you get like Gareth Hunt has a puppet. And it's coming out with all this like really sort of deep existentialist philosophy, and then somebody dressed up as Biggles comes over and starts like reeling off poetry and all of this kind of and then in the end they're in like a limo, and Josh Ackland is a serial killer in it, and he pops up, and along the way you get some Pet Shop Boys tunes, but the main theme you never hear, and it's called "It Couldn't Happen Here." And it's like a thoroughly, when you get songs which are just ooze like deep depression and melancholy, but you love it. A bit like the Ennio Morricone to Once Upon a Time in America, actually. Yeah. So that's I would advise just that's an interesting thing by the Pet Shop Boys. Yeah.
That's interesting. I was interested in your impressions of it because there's something about the way this film relates to it as well. The way that film about Walton on the Naze, the Suffolk coast, and I talked about how it carried a sort of double weight of meaning because the coast was being eroded by these natural processes, and so was the way of life. And this is another story in a sense about erosion. It's an economic and political erosion, but it's not about the social problems. It's the engineering problems. And the implication of that means that Curtis can focus on where the power nodes are that are dealing with it. And the people are not in the narrative. They've been swept away already. Sorry, I cut across you.
No, all I was going to say was that as depressing as some of these scenes are, how can I say, it's still not a Somalian bringing her to Uber Eats, is it? Do you know what I mean? It's like, I don't know. There's a sense in which I can kind of, comfort's probably the wrong word, but there's a sense in which I don't get the same, like somebody mentioned UK. To me, that thing UK has only existed like since about 2010, and it's like those horrible Zoomer rappers they all watch, KSI, and it's the JD Sports aesthetic and all of that sort of stuff, which has nothing to do with the country I grew up in whatsoever.
Yeah, I think I did a thing on Twitter yesterday where I contrasted the Get Carter car park, Trinity Square, with what's on Tyneside now, which is the Sage. And I think that the difference is because everybody moaned about the Get Carter car park because it dominated the Tyne, like the skyline south of the Tyne and Gateshead. But what it is, I think, is that the distinction is that you can have your own place, but it can be kind of twisted and warped in different ways. And this is what, say, the Pet Shop Boys would do, and it couldn't happen here. It's the English seaside town resort, just even more depressing than normal, but it's still ours. But what UK does, or the Sage does, is just complete deterritorialization, where you're wandering around in a space which you can't even claim is yours anymore. And there's a big difference in that. Because it's very difficult to draw a kind of aesthetic from it, which is deep. All it does is lead to complete alienation in a way that the Get Carter car park didn't. It was just a sort of phase that Britain was going through. The UK is almost like the end, the permanent end. It's the
sort of backfilling of the hole, isn't it, that's been left?
I mean, if anyone's ever been to Woking, right? I mean, Woking isn't even in its heyday. I would say Woking never the most gratifying place to visit, right? But if you go to Woking now, there's this kind of mall area they've got, which is like a kind of it's like a food parade of the world type thing, where right, but it's really shit. And then there's like, oh, here's a vape store, here's like a bit selling like the covers for mobile phones, here's like another bit, and every single one of these stores has just got like a depressed looking Indian or Pakistani or something on them, and you're like this is just a horrible place. Like the lighting is horrible. It doesn't feel like it belongs to anywhere. None of the shops look very nice. It's like none of the food looks very nice. And it's like this, when I think of UK, I think of that bit of Woking where it's just, and I assume there are places like this all around the UK now, just in random towns.
Do you remember on your list of 100 films that you had The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover?
Yes,
and that whole film's a kind of metaphor for Thatcherism, it seems, and also one of the sort of themes is kind of death by cuisine, and that's kind of going to be one of the UK's epitaphs, really. It's grim.
So let's get going, shall we?
The day-to-day problems of living in tower blocks have been carefully chronicled for more than 20 years. This film is not about those social problems. It's about the growing realization that many of the blocks were not built properly. As a result, hundreds of them are potentially dangerous and may have to be demolished. This is an inquiry into the origins of that disaster and into how it was allowed to happen.
How many years before Grenfell was this? When did Grenfell happen? Was
2017, I think. And it'll come in at the end of this. Yeah. The whole business with the cladding will come in. It's a kind of ominous thing that they leave you with. I'm telling you, one day this is going to go wrong. But if you were watching this in 1984, you think it'll be fine. and it's not going to be a load of client groups from the regime that's inside it either when it goes up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If you're wondering, by the way, folks, Juan Lepers number 2 for today. I know some cigar enthusiasts would like to know what I'm having, so there we are.
The only answer is more houses. The government are looking to increasing the productivity in the building industry and are basing all their plans during the following 5 years on reaching and maintaining a level of 400,000 houses a year.
With this speech, the then Minister of Housing, Sir Keith Joseph, is generally credited with starting what became known as the numbers game.
And here I come to a very strange omission from the socialist proceedings last week. In all their official speeches condemning us and our efforts, in all their official speeches, they never mentioned a target of their own. The Liberals at least disagreed about one. Their conference wanted 500,000 houses. The platform settled for 375,000 houses.
Is this the Tories doing their game of
Yep.
we're better at being Labour than Labour even back then? Is
Exactly
that what they're doing?
Exactly that. For anyone who doesn't know as well, this is Keith Joseph, who later became sort of Thatcherite before Thatcher. He sort of converted to the Milton Friedman monetarist view and started saying socialism was the problem. I mean, I don't know how deep rooted his belief was, but yeah, by the mid 70s, I think about the time Thatcher became leader, he was the leading sort of person in Parliament promoting the ideas that became called Thatcherism. But like a lot of them, like Enoch Powell, I think, no, actually not Enoch Powell, I shouldn't say him, but most of the others, like at this time, this is under Macmillan, late Macmillan time, they were all just socialists or social democrats or whatever you call it, Keynesian mixed economy guys. And Joseph was as bad as any of them. And they're outflanking Labour to the left, saying, we will build more houses or state.
This is the so-called post-war consensus, which like many a young man, I learnt it from the Beatles, Taxman, Mr. Wilson and Mr. Heath, right? Because they were basically they're basically the same. Well, I didn't grow up in the 60s, so I had to learn it from the Beatles.
So Joseph embodied like the post-war consensus under Macmillan's time, and maybe Eden and Churchill as well. But yeah, under Macmillan, and then he personified the end of it as well. He was like one of the first people to turn against it in the 70s and inspired Thatcher.
Nicknamed the Mad Monk, wasn't it?
Yeah, nicknamed by the wet in the party. They called him the Mad Monk. Yeah.
But the Labour Party never had an official target at all. That seems very odd for a party that's so sure it can do better.
Britain is today being held to ransom by a small but unscrupulous group of land speculators and profiteers who are lining their pockets tax-free at the expense of local councils, trying to rehouse overcrowded families and of young couples.
The Labour Party rose to the Conservative bait. A crucial part of their 1964 election campaign was the promise to build 500,000 houses a year. Labour won the election, and Harold Wilson moved in triumph to Downing Street. He chose as housing minister one of the party's intellectuals, Richard Crossman, who now faced the unenviable task of turning a political promise into reality.
Just want to stop something. I want to think about the whole post-war consensus and why it was like it was from Clement Attlee until this point, and basically from Clement Attlee to Thatcher. Was it basically they'd sent millions of men to die in World War II, right? Basically, like, screwed up the empire, as we've talked about many times, and they were like, shit, we probably owe them something, so we better give them something back. So let's give them, I know, like, they gave them higher wages. You've never had it so good, Macmillan said, right? And it was like, right, we better build some houses too. Is that like the basic? Do you think that's fair to say? It was like a kind of, in a strange way,
It's the payoff.
thank you from the British ruling class to Tommy in the trenches.
Were you going to answer, Simon, or otherwise I will?
No, you go ahead. I mean, all I would say is it was a moment where, like A is suggesting, there had to be, as Curtis would say, an optimistic vision to offer the people. The guys coming back from World War I, I think, had been given, a substantial sum of money that would buy a house. The guys demobbed from World War II got, quite a bit less than that. And as time went on, people, realized that there has to be sort of something to justify the land fit for heroes that they were told they were coming back to. So
the land fit for heroes. Well, that was a David Lloyd George phrase, was it, from First World War?
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
I think, or use the phrase "homes fit for heroes" to accompany it, that existing slogan, maybe. Yeah. So during both World Wars, I mean, certainly from the Prime Minister in the First World War, and maybe from lower level people in the Second, yeah, the message does seem to have been put out to a lot of the working class. Apparently, especially in the East End of London, this was done. Like people literally going around just telling people, "You're going to have paradise after." Maybe not in those terms, but you're going to have a safe, good life after the war. We're going to reward you for what you've done, for your sacrifices, right? The East End was the place getting bombed the most and all this. But you must also account for the 1930s. Harold Macmillan in particular had already gone over to Keynesianism by, I think, the early 30s, because obviously you had the Great Depression. A lot of people's response to the Great Depression, which started in say 29 with the Wall Street crash, roughly, right? Maybe a bit before. But a lot of people's response to that was to say capitalism has failed, and that was it. Capitalism was in the past, was moving into the past, right? And they believed in Keynesianism, and that is probably more true of the Labour Party than the Tories, but still a lot of Tories, including all of those who were in the focus and became part of Churchill's wartime government or regime, and who then dominated Tory politics until Thatcher. So for 30 years, the following 30 years of the war, and that is Macmillan, Eden. Churchill himself, I don't think used to say things like capitalism has failed, but he's just someone who didn't really think that much about economics, I think, and just thought more or less anything he would do. He wasn't a socialist. He definitely wasn't a socialist, but he didn't mind having Macmillan and Eden in his, next in line in his cabinet and so on.
I think it's also the case, though, that within the context of the Cold War, like some of the places where people lived after the war were legitimately bad. It isn't that they didn't have very good places to live. It's just that what they were going to make for them was crap. But the wider problem within the Cold War, if you want to think of it as containment, is that if you've got 15 to 20 million men who've just come back from a war and who can fight a war, and you've got them now back home and they're living in mold-infested slums, which is quite literally what happens here is the slum clearances. This is a danger when you're going up against communists. So you could say that it was containment to make sure they didn't wander too far off the plantation and that they weren't too far dispossessed.
And it is true, like there was already, again, I'm referring to the East End of London. I don't know about the whole country, but there was already massive overcrowding, terrible quality of homes, like slum, just referred to as slums. And like that was a problem maybe even at the start of the 20th century, which wasn't solved until after the war. So there's all these things came together at once. Yeah, there was a lot of homes that were just cleared away and destroyed, and people were rehoused elsewhere, but they were rehoused in these massive system-built.
This actually happened in America as well. Right. It was a big part of FDR's New Deal, and I remember finding loads of when I was putting together the Boomer Truth stuff years ago. Remember, I used a lot of archival material in that. There was a lot of public information films put out by FDR and later Truman on demolishing some of the inner cities, the slum areas, as they called them, and basically like doing the American version of this. What they ended up doing in America, which is a story not told that often, is that's when they moved a lot of the ethnic groups into the cities and a lot of the white population out to the suburbs. It happened during that era as part of this massive kind of rehousing. I can't remember exactly what they called it now, but it's part of the New Deal impetus that they did there. Here, I just find it really interesting that this dynamic of, oh, thanks for serving us in the war and defeating Hitler or whatever, here's a high-rise flat to live in. It just feels a bit like derisory. Do you know what I mean?
With some damp. Yeah. What you said about the process of moving people out to new, I mean, in this case, system-built housing, but sort of state-arranged housing and social housing. I mean, what's called social housing, right? Like that. So in America, that process was also a way to begin moving people, a lot of blacks from the South, into northern cities and stuff, like Baltimore or wherever, New York. That is the same with the East End of London. Again, I haven't studied the whole country, but there happens to be a book called The New East End, which I'm my next Substack article will be about. And it shows that's how Bangladeshis were moved in as part of the same process. I mean, it's much more complicated than that, but yeah, that was done by the state, basically.
They did the Commonwealth Act
48, yeah.
48, right, okay. So
you mean, the Nationalities Act, right?
Right.
The Nationalities Act that gave everybody citizenship, you mean?
They'd started coming. I had to study at one point the Angry Young Men, the John Osborne and so on. And if you watch some of the British New Wave cinema in the 50s, you do start seeing ethnics in those films. Typically it'd be like a sailor or some like illicit lover or something like that. But it does start to enter in like around that time. And I think,
they were building Britain, so.
Well, exactly. The diversity built Britain, exactly. But I mean, but in all seriousness, I think there was an influx. I think, literally, it goes from practically zero to about 50,000 around 1950 sort of time, and then it keeps on going up. I don't know exactly by the 60s what the numbers would be, but you could have been approaching the millions by that point, from a starting point of almost zero when World War II ended. So
yeah, I think it took about sort of 15 to 20 years after the Windrush to get up to the first million. Now it's obviously over 1 million per year, which is somewhat different. But what Morgoth said, I just wanted to refer back to about a lot of people, before the war, maybe even before the First World War, I don't know, but had like terrible quality housing, right? Really, really bad, like ill making, and it's described in the Northwest by Orwell in The Road to Wigan Pier as well. Just the standard of housing a lot of people had. There was that problem already, and obviously then the war also destroyed another, I don't know, tens of thousands of homes as well, especially in the East End, also some in the Northeast, I think, and Coventry and Birmingham and so on. And anywhere that was bombed, heavy industrial sites, especially docks, obviously Liverpool. So that destroyed loads of housing as well. So there was several problems that came together, and obviously one thing we know about major wars is they're sort of an opportunity for planners as well, right? For planners who already had schemes, they get an opportunity because we can clear all this away. We've got an excuse to do so.
One of the things, I haven't watched this yet, but maybe it will answer this question. One of the things I don't quite understand is that, generally speaking, when you find housing that was built in the 30s or in the Victorian era, like I grew up in a Victorian era house, for example. You still see houses that were built in the 30s, all around the country. It's generally like pretty good quality, like built of brick, and if they're decently maintained, they're still good houses even today. People live in them all over the country. Is it just that they had allowed these houses to fall into disrepair, or they hadn't been maintained, or was there actually a stock of like bad cheap housing that was all knocked down? Like I don't understand that part of it, because I always associate the older housing as being pretty good,
Yeah, I mean, I put out a little video of some of the back-to-back housing, which was the sort of, the housing for the poorest people, working class people, which were essentially, they weren't like terraces as such. They were, houses that were joined together like terraces, but they had usually no running water, no electricity. They had a backyard with a wash house and toilets, and generally a one-room floor plan. It might have been over a couple of stories if you were lucky, I suppose. But you essentially had very, very basic housing. And this was because I think there was a legislative restriction on what councils were able to provide. But as people have pointed out on Twitter, a lot of councils were sort of, very much on their uppers at this point, or some of them bankrupt after the war. And what happened in 1949 was you had the Housing Act, which allowed councils to look at building new properties where they didn't have the legal obligation just to look at housing for working class people. They could sort of look at different income groups and create houses, if you like, for commercial sale as well to young up and comers and the middle class and so on. So there was a sort of a de-restriction in terms of the ability of them to sort of surge ahead. And this, of course, lured in people like the system builders.
Sure. I mean, another question I've got is how much of it is the fact that these houses, the old houses, didn't have running water, or they didn't have electricity, or central heating, or things like that, and it was easier just to knock them down and build these high rises rather than try to engineer in all these things for these houses that weren't designed for those things.
Well, that's possibly when they say the advisor there was, one of the kind of intellectual set. There was possibly a sort of creeping continentalism coming from things like, I mean, obviously in the background of this show is someone like Le Corbusier in Europe, who is developing this modernist architecture, not brutalism as such, but this sort of phenomenon of building these absolutely massive, as he famously says, machines for living, which, if you like, give people certain qualities and withdraw others. So there's this element of seeing it as an efficiency, but a certain kind of urban harmony as well. Urban planning is becoming a thing here. We're going to see with Newcastle, where T. Dan Smith comes in and he starts the first planning department in the UK, and he makes it the department of primacy within the council. So there's this surge of enthusiasm to as Tony Blair would say, to reimagine the urban space. And of course, people can get very carried away with that level of imagination. So that's kind of I think a convergence of that. That remnant post-war intellectual set who have kind of hovered around Europe. I mean, Le Corbusier himself, is seen somewhat as a controversial figure now because he offered his services, both to Moustache Man, to Chin Man, and to Soviet Union Man as well. And he was sort of quite ideologically promiscuous, and I suppose in the sense of any architect. I mean, like I did a little clip about from a Robert Hughes program about Albert Speer. These guys were just ambitious to get their work out there on a massive scale, because architecture has that power to direct people in certain ways and to reinforce, if you like, the episteme of the state at that time. So it's kind of a sort of heady mix.
I mean,
go
on, Horace. Go on.
Anyone who wants to know more about Le Corbusier, there's a series on YouTube. The first episode of it is about Francis Stoner Saunders's. Well, the whole series is by Francis Stoner Saunders, but the first episode is about the CIA supporting people like Richard Crossman here on the screen and other, the right of the Labour Party types. But the second episode is about Le Corbusier and his school of architecture. It's on YouTube. It's good.
I was just going to mention that. I mean, especially for younger people who won't remember. I mean, I barely remember it because it was kind of really on its way out when I was a kid. But when I was growing up in the 1980s, I remember certain things. Like, I mean, the house I grew up in is a Victorian house. It was built in the 19th century. But I remember my dad literally putting in the central heating. Like there was a massive old, literally Victorian cistern there that he had to re-engineer it. He did it himself because he's an engineer. But I also remember things like, there was still like the rag and bone man that used to come around. I remember there was a little antique store, long gone now, but you'd go in there and they didn't have there was still like an old stove, and they'd all be round the stove, and they were wearing those little gloves. It was like walking into Steptoe and Son or something, right?
Yeah.
And like if you fast forward 10 years, so say like from 1987 to 1997, you just didn't see that in the 90s. But there was still that kind of remnant of a really like that antiques family that I'm talking about there. You could have they could have been in Charles Dickens or something like that. Do you know what I mean? I think you saw stuff like that fairly regularly, in the 80s, because there was still this sense that not everything was fully modernized in that way. And I think we got this idea that modernity starts and everybody's got everything all the time, but it wasn't really like that. So it's just something I don't know if you guys remember anything like, any of those sorts of things, but that there were.
Yeah. There was a level of decrepitude when I was growing up that was just like I said before, the house my grandmother lived in, I spent a lot of time in, was like the one from the birthday party. It was kind of quite grimy like that. It was the serving hatch, and everything was kind of a bit tatty. In fact, you could tell the last time it had been done up was probably the 1930s or 1940s. And so the visions of modernity that were being offered were extremely tempting. Obviously, people didn't realize the consequences of how it would become not so much a vision of town planners, but a game of corruption that would strip out any of the kind of socially idealist qualities that people I guess even like Corbusier himself tried to project. But then it became this intellectual exercise where some of the demands were quite, in Corbusier, he formed a group of architects called SIAM, Congrès International de whatever something, Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, and they had these sort of precepts about delivering this sort of stuff. So they kind of wanted these massive spaces, which in a sense were kind of crowding out everything else. Again, it was very like sort of the way that Speer in Germany had conceived of they were going to rebuild Berlin, as Robert Hughes calls it, cynical relativistic Berlin, the sort of bohemia that the regime didn't like, and they were going to crowd it out with these massive oversized buildings. And part of Le Corbusier was he was following a similar sort of principle. So you would have a sense of convenience about the way the buildings were sort of completely integrated within themselves to an extent, and they would also have certain conditions about working out the how the roads should be, scientifically, to sort of manage the sort of types of traffic, and it would be sort of commuter based. You would try to locate your industrial areas nearby. And one other thing that was particularly poignant was that in terms of conservation, they would only keep historic monuments or buildings if they were of value. And whatever determines that value is not quite spoken of. But the main aim was to reduce, the unhealthy living conditions of things like the tenements, the slums, the back-to-backs.
Yeah, I was going to say as well, it's interesting when you think that the NHS came along at the same time as all of this began to come in. And it was as if they'd come up with like a design for life, as the Manic Street Preacher said, where it was like, well, we're going to have this public health service, but then by extension, we also need, like, people can't be living in moldy, decrepit housing anymore. So we're going to have to get onto that as well, because then the improved living conditions will complement the NHS. And so you've got this kind of expansive technocratic planning beginning properly to creep in, managerialism, if you like, beginning properly to creep into all these different, one thing inevitably leads to another.
Yeah, but what I was trying to get at, though, from what I can remember of the 80s, and granted I was, younger than 11 in the 80s, right? But I remember there was, like, in the town I grew up, there were still spaces that were kind of like untouched by the managerial state. And what I mean by that is like, oh, this used to be a stable once upon a time. Now it's like you can just see like the old wooden door hanging off, and it was just being left. Now that would be boarded up, or it'd have some like health and safety sign on it, or it would be have a border around it, right? It'd be cordoned off by the state, right? Right, but that didn't happen like as quickly and easily back then. Whereas now, there is no sense of any of that kind of like remnant of, let's just say, Victorian Britain or something like that still left over. Because at some point in the 90s, all of those things were just swept away, basically, or cordoned off, or whereas they've been left for so many years or whatever. So I don't know if you guys had a sense of that where you grew up, but certainly it was the case in Wales.
Where I grew up in North Tyneside and across the northeast, you see, the reason why there was pit villages across the northeast was because there was pits there. And in the 80s, which I still remember, all of the pits began to close down, but what you had was these huge areas of slag, of wasteland. and what it would be like these massive heaps. Like they'd be big. They'd be like, I mean, to me at the time, it seemed like mountains of slag, and it was all just there. And some of it became this like dangerous boggy marsh. But what you would do would go. People went in on motorbikes and BMXs. And it would be where you could, like, the side of the heap would drop down like 100 meters or something, and it would be like a straight drop with a like concrete sticking out at the end. I remember one, it was called the Deathy, because you'd go down at like 50 miles an hour and jump off. And there was people breaking their necks on all of the time on BMXs and all of that kind of thing. But these things were peppered all over the Northeast, all over the place. Partly, I think we'll come onto it with Killingworth. There's a bit of a story there because Killingworth, where they had all these high rises, that had its own pit as well. But Killingworth was modernised. Well, that's what they called it. We'll see how that turned out. But the rest of them, it was mainly houses that were built. But as you say, it just seems wild. And then in the 90s, what they began to do was put a little thin bit of topsoil across the top of all of the slag and plant trees in. So they all got tarted up. And now I've actually been out walking the dog on these places, and you'll see people from like the south of England. And it's like, oh, it's lovely to be in like the rolling hills of the northeast. and it's like, I'm just like, sweetheart, you're like 6 inches above a big pile of toxic slag. And what happens is they've planted all these fast-growing conifer trees that they've imported from places like California, and the roots can't get down through the slag, which is only like literally just under a thin layer of topsoil. So whenever there's a strong gust of wind, they all just get blown down immediately, just go down like dominoes. And there's this like big gaping hole of post-industrial gloom staring back at all of these people. But yeah, it was, and I think that's why I kind of had that thing where there was this kind of dusty post-industrial hangover. Blythe, in particular, with the power station sort of looming over the northeast coastline, it was pretty grim, but it was authentic, and I kind of liked it.
It's funny you're saying that, because it does make you think about those landscapes that those people are sort of wandering over. That they're fake landscapes, you know, in a way that these places, these machines for living, became fake homes. They were just storage units for humans.
Right, so I reckon we've had a good intro, chaps, but we're going to have to play this.
Crossman appointed the managing director of Costains, the building contractors, as a special advisor. Together they pinned their hopes on a new and untried method of building.
It does, of course, mean factory-built houses, but factory-built houses can be just as good as production line cars. And I think we're going to move to this. The only thing is to make sure that they're done by good architects and well landscaped, and that will get over any danger of monotony. The main thing is you standardize the production. The whole of one wall is done in a single part, and you standardize.
That will get over any danger of monotony.
Amazing.
Down to say 20 or 22 parts. And then you put the house together on the site, having bought it, shall we say, by lorry. And once you get the thing going, of course, at the factory built, they do come off jolly fast, and that means the local authorities got to get the gas ready, the electricity ready.
So you've got to realise that although the government made the promises in its election campaigns for 400,000 a year, 500,000 a year, and so forth, it wasn't the government that had to build them, it was the local authorities that had to build them. So the government then put the pressure on local authorities to take up these systems. And, of course, the government also put pressure on the major building contractors, who didn't need a great deal of pressing.
So many that only factory-made floor and wall units of precast concrete can keep pace with the scheduled program. So a new plant...
Sensing a huge new market, the contractors invested millions of pounds in production facilities, often before securing a single firm order. Their confidence was based on the knowledge that the government had introduced a system of subsidies to encourage councils to use industrialised methods and to build as high as possible.
The destination is the building site.
The narrator, Simon, is of the Melvin Bragg school. He
Mm.
very much reminds me of Melvin Bragg. His kind of narration style.
Interesting point also to consider that this is the moment where I think Angela Rayner's been told to build how many? 1.5 million new homes. Yeah. I mean, these systems you're seeing here, the first one we saw there with the sort of guys putting the slabs together. I mean, basically these are sort of tongue and groove preformed concrete slabs. That one was called the Bison system. Bison are still a big player in doing this stuff today. Obviously, they've somewhat tarted up their image from dodgy flats in the 60s and 70s. But the relationship, as they say there, between the subsidies and the sort of efflorescence of these manufacturers cashing in is something to bear in mind.
I've always thought the Tory party are very in bed with the construction
major donors. The major donors, and land banking obviously is one of the key concerns in the country. The speculative asset bubble of housing kept artificially high for decades, since probably the mid to late 1980s, when it just went ballistic. And of course, now houses are 30 times what people are earning.
Morgoth, you specifically did a video about the relationship between the construction firms and the Tories, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I've done one or two. I did one which was called The Last Fields of North Tyneside. That was an older one. And I did another one. I think it might have been in that, but it was all of the construction companies. Because I was actually looking for different people who are funding the Tories. Like, you know, I thought it would be different groups and different players.
You mean the lumber firms, right? You mean you mean the lumber firms you were thinking of, right?
Well, no, I was thinking of different groups. But I thought that was going to be like who the paymasters were, and maybe it is somewhere in different ways. But just on this, I think this was like 2019 video or something I did. But it was the construction companies, like they just absolutely dominated who pays the Tories, and it was kind of like I thought it was going to be something a bit more nefarious. And I always come back to it, you know, like this happens to me more and more now. Do you know the end of Die Hard when like Bruce Willis is all battered to pieces and he realizes that it isn't like a big terrorist thing, it's just a robbery. And he looks at Hans and he says, so this is what it was all about. It's just a fucking robbery. That's increasingly what I feel like when I dig into the politics of the British. Like Bruce Willis just battered to pieces and he realizes actually they're all just swindling twats.
Mm-hmm.
It always seems so small time and grubby, though. Do you know what I mean? I think it's so like the one other thing I just want to mention before we carry on. You mentioned Angela Rayner there. Some people may not know that the Red Queen was ready to walk. I don't know if you caught this, Morgoth, right? She'd been told she had to build 1.5 million homes, and she was ready to resign. And apparently there was an intervention from that man who so seldom intervenes in British politics. Blair himself basically talked her off the ledge and said, no, you have to stay and do this. So
she didn't want to build the houses or what?
She was like, it can't be done. It's impossible. And she was ready to quit. And do you remember there was that mysterious event like late in the winter, just before Christmas, where it was like an audience with Tony Blair and Angela Rayner. Like, you never see those two together. Probably then, right? That's when they would have seen each other. So,
I mean, 1.5 million is mad. You see that clip we saw at the beginning there. They're promising 500,000 a year, and of course, we know it's kind of pie in the sky ambition. So to ask her to build 3 times that is,
and you know, Starmer's already lent on the councils once with the potholes. When I looked into like his whole pothole scheme is basically to say, look, here's £1 billion. If you haven't sorted it out, I'm going to come down hard on the councils, right? Trouble is, as I mentioned in that video, the actual cost of the potholes is about 20 times the amount of money that Starmer's allocated. But there is this kind of weird thing where the national government can blame the councils and the councils can blame the national government, and they can keep on like passing the buck back and forth. But Starmer's tried to get ahead by saying like, I'm doing something about the potholes. He set them up to fail, basically, which is probably why Rayner is trying to get that housing thing off her desk too, because somebody somewhere is going to fail because it is probably impossible. But anyway, let's go.
The Farage campaign for the potholes is wank as well. What he's doing, where it's like, oh look, this cheeky chappy is planting flowers in the potholes, and then he posts these videos on Twitter. And then I saw one the other day where somebody was playing golf and using the potholes as like the putt, like putting the ball into the potholes. And I thought it's all just so cheeky and winky. Like, why not have like total desaturated black and white doom and gloom peak UK aesthetic of people like slamming their wheels into these potholes and smacking their heads off the side of the car because the potholes are smashing all their cars up and everything. Like make it impactful instead of this kind of, look at me in my tweed. Oh, well, let's have a little game of golf.
I found myself more
bullshit.
Unironically retweeting Alistair Campbell the other day on exactly that, because Campbell saw that video of Farage with the potholes, and he just said, "Look at this smiling clownish twat or whatever." And Campbell is like really foul-mouthed in that way. And he was saying, "Look, he hasn't got a plan. He's just a clown." I was like, that is basically true. That's basically true of those pothole videos he's putting out at the minute.
Nero fiddles Jerome Burns.
Depressingly, they're probably about to win a pile of council seats in the local elections, which are coming up. But anyway, let's carry on.
But Nero had the excuse. Nero had the excuse of insanity. Farage doesn't. So,
you think?
We'd always hoped that there would be a day when buildings could be more or less made in factories and they're just assembled on the site. So to us, this seemed as though the day had come at last. If the parts could be made in a factory where they would be under controlled conditions, where you could have proper inspectors, where you could have proper plant, as they did have, and then the only task then remained would be to assemble them on the site. Obviously, this seemed a straightforward thing to do.
In the present housing shortage, time is the essence of the contract, and so is money. The sector system...
Given the size of their investment, the contractors were also concerned with time and money. They sent out special teams of salesmen to travel around Britain. Part of their job was to entertain local councillors, usually in the best hotels, whose dining rooms began to enjoy a mini-boom of their own.
This hotel, of course, this particular type of room was typical of rooms all over the country, but all of the major contractors and most of the major professions, architects, engineers and surveyors, used to literally travel around every day of every week, and they were looking for people who had access to public contracts, of which at that time I was one. The local authority people, having to meet targets and having to get production, were facing a construction industry and the contracting industry, of which McAlpines were one, Laings were another, Costains were another, Wimpy's were another. Wimpy's used to be in here every day. I can't remember offhand the name of the guy. But his full-time job was entertaining and meeting local authority people. And then they also had the perks, the test matches. Wimpy's always, every test match series used to have a marquee on the rugby side of the ground at Leeds. There were tickets to Ascot if you wanted to go, the boxes at Ascot. There were the precious Friday centre court tickets at Wimbledon.
T. Dan Smith succumbed to another variety of perks.
And who were they meeting? Basically councillors, right? Basically
yes.
Town councillors, right?
Yes.
Yes. And to give context, it's not like I say. It's kind of easier to become a town councillor than an MP, right? I mean, to put it into context, remember Alien Man, Simon Parks? He was a councillor, for example, right? I mean, so it's kind of
you see councillors on Twitter all the time. Some of them, they're morons. I mean, not all of them, but. This would also be, they would also be lobbying or bribing, like it would be the elected councillors, like I think T. Dan Smith was elected, right? You've also got the unelected staff of a council, which is loads more people, and they've got loads of power as well, but they're bureaucrat, civil servant types. I bet they were being bribed as well.
If we just run it on a little bit, we're going to have to stop it anyway, because, I mean, this is a major part of this whole story, just in a couple of seconds of footage.
By joining John Poulson, the corrupt architect. Together they climbed aboard the industrialised building bandwagon, which by now had built up a momentum of its own. The systems on offer were so complicated that only the contractors and their engineers understood them.
Pause.
The controls and checks that council...
So these are the sort of this is the major, I quote, villain of the piece. This is John Paulson. He was an architect. He was an extremely mediocre architect. He was from Leeds. He was a son of a Methodist preacher. He was hopeless at school. He didn't even really qualify as an architect. And what he was good at was connecting people up and getting projects and contracts. But Paulson himself was a kind of, you know, there was a guy who, one of his employers, when he started out, before his father gave him money to start his own architectural practice, but because he was so hopeless, one of his previous employers was quoted as saying, this is from his obituary, he said, "Have you heard that Paulson's starting on his own? Christ, he couldn't design a brick shithouse." So he was the guy who got together with T. Dan Smith. T. Dan Smith ran a PR firm, and he and Paulson together, siphoned off massive amounts of money. I mean, it's impossible to say really how much Paulson made. We know the sorts of levels of bribes he was giving out to officials to get housing contracts. The likelihood is that Paulson made, in today's money, it's kind of hard to calculate, but between 14 and 20 million in today's money from scoring sort of council contracts.
I can't help but think, Simon, that later Adam Curtis would have introduced this character to us with Dusty Springfield's Son of a Preacher Man.
Yeah.
It just feels like, you know, this sequence with him driving, with that blaring, and the, you know, obviously young Curtis was less confident, or hasn't found his style yet.
Well, actually, yeah, people were. I've mentioned to Morgoth as well. There's the TV drama Our Friends in the North that was made in 1996, which had characters loosely based on T. Dan Smith and John Paulson. And it was based on a play that had been done at the RSC in the 80s. And one of the reasons they'd waited to kind of get it to television was because they were worried about these guys suing them. And both of these guys died in 1993. So then they could kind of get on and make the drama fairly safely. But I mean, T. Dan Smith himself is an interesting figure. He was elected to the city council in 1959. Before that, he'd been a businessman running painters and decorators, and he was creaming off again the equivalent today of nearly £500,000 in contract money from the council, just supplying painting and decorating. Apparently, he had a kind of very much a sofa style of government. He had an inner cabinet of supporters, and very much kind of ruled in a sort of Blair dictatorial style, let's say. Morgoth, I sent you a little film about him. I don't know what your impressions were of Paulson from living, in that region, because he's before my time and he's a bit of a mystery to me.
Well, the Stan Smith, I remember from Our Friends in the North, in that his character is played by Alan Armstrong. Who's an actor. People, I mean, I know this is a bit of an obscure reference, but he's like the cool guy with two swords in Krull. If anybody remembers that, he's like the coolest character in Krull. But in this, what I said it here, the thing about Smith was that he was like this hardcore Trotskyist. And I've heard it mentioned when people complain about the horrible, they'll call it brutalist. A lot of it isn't all brutalist, but I get what they mean. The construction that we're talking about here, and people have said to me in the past, it was designed by Trotskyists and communists. And I've always thought that was a strange thing, because I thought, well, the Northeast wasn't really like that. But it was actually true. Like they were like Leninists and Trotskyists. And there was a clip on what you sent me. Who was who made that video, Simon?
Oh, it was made back in the sort of late 80s. A couple of BBC guys, I think. But it was a sort of independent. It was like a docudrama, bits of dramatization and bits of interview with the people.
And basically, the plot was from Smith to put this into context, was that by this time Newcastle was gone from an industrialized, supplying the empire with coal to being this rundown, depressing backwater. And Smith's plan was to use, raw elite theory to create an organized minority, and him and his friends have a little back and forth about whether they need 10 people or 6 people. And his plan is that if you've got 10 good men, you can take over Newcastle Town Council and you can flex with your power on there, and then you can use that as a springboard to influence all of the country with your vision, if you like. And they seem to have done it. And you can see that the results of it were that they kind of grifted it all into the ground and put up these flats left, right, and centre. And this is the story of our friends in the north. Though I would say in our friends in the north, there's much more emphasis on the PR kind of whining and dining aspect of it, rather than the Trotskyism and the communist revolutionary stuff.
Yeah, because that drama, it sort of takes it as read, actually. They're all sort of, supporters of the Labour Party. I mean, in fact, T. Dan Smith was kicked out of the Labour Party because he was, quote, too left-wing. And then he was actually kicked out of the Revolutionary Communist Party. That's not the same one that the spiked people came from. But he was kicked out of there for being, I don't know, kind of unethical in some way.
That's the People's Revolutionary Party over there. Sorry, I have to make that joke every time. Sorry.
No, there have been at least two parties called the Revolutionary Communist Party.
Yeah,
as well.
Yeah. And so he kind of went his own way, and as Morgoth said, he had a kind of, he was kind of, Trotskyist in the streets, Leninist between the sheets. He had a kind of a ruthlessness about him in terms, because that was funny, that clip, the bloke people he was saying about, could you take the country with 10 people, and he sort of, didn't he reconsider, and he says, maybe 6, something like that.
His buddy says we could probably do it with 6. I mean, okay, I got to appreciate it,
Yeah, totally. And the bribery was just off the scale. Sorry, go ahead, Horace.
Anyone who hasn't watched Our Friends in the North is a really excellent drama, like the best British TV drama I've seen. But just a bit of context for this as well. T. Dan Smith, by the time this documentary was on, which was 84, he'd done a prison term. Maybe they say that in this program.
Yeah.
He's out of prison and he's talking about his own crimes here.
Councils normally exercised were almost useless. The contractor's package deal was everything.
The contractors were allowed to employ the architects, the quantity surveyors and the engineers and sell them to the local authority. That's what a package deal was. But the architects, if you like, they were like doctors protesting about witch doctors and allowing the witch doctors to practice. They were allowing contractors to organize the architectural and professional people to sell to the local authorities, and themselves weren't prepared to do it. And so the contractor, in fact, was the designer, the producer of the materials, and the supervisor of the job.
Faced by the contractor's newfound powers and by the government's massive subsidies, many councils felt they were being made offers they couldn't refuse. Nottingham Council agreed to build 2 huge developments costing £6 million.
I can remember very well taking them to committee. And
look at the bloody stunning architecture.
Just to make that point there, that it's important to distinguish. It's the process of what Paulson did with people like Smith and doing his PR is persuading councils to hand everything over to Paulson. So the central, if you like, the bureaucrats, the town planners as such, were cut out of the loop. So whatever idealistic schemes they had in mind were just as nothing to the incentives of the kind of corruption that was going on. I mean, at Paulson, there was one guy who was a surveyor for British Rail Southern Region, and he would give Paulson contacts for the development of places like London Waterloo, Cannon Street, East Croydon. And Paulson would give him, 25 quid and 3 shillings a week and the loan of a car. Yeah. But in the time he worked for Paulson, he made something like £8,457, which is about £175,000 in today's money. Yeah. Another bribe, Paulson gave a guy £30,000. That's £589,000 in today's money. There's 23 authorities, about 300 people involved, and a lot of this was considered when they addressed the Bribery Act in 2010. And this was across the field. I mean, Polson made contacts with Labour people and with Conservatives as well. There was one interesting case of a Labour MP who he got involved with, a chap called Albert Roberts, who was a member for Normanton in West Yorkshire, and he was just censured by Parliament for acting inconsistently with the standards of the Commons. He was quite an interesting figure because he was in favour of bringing back Hango, and he was a supporter of bringing back hanging, and he was a supporter of General Franco as well. So it shows you how far Labour have come in terms of their preferences.
Both schemes going through in something like about 2 minutes flat. The following scheme for something like a £2,000 toilet block was probably discussed for half an hour. But I was certainly, it's ingrained in my memory that these two schemes were disposed of so quickly by committee. Not that I expected committee to do any more, but I remember it well.
Do you think that's a criticism of the committee, or is it a reflection of the mood of the times?
A reflection of the mood of the times, undoubtedly. Get it built as quickly as possible, then think.
Princess Margaret's arrival in Woolwich marked a big day for the borough. The princess, accompanied by her husband, had come to perform the official opening of the new Tower Flats in the parish of St Mary. The ceremony was simple, the unveiling of a tablet recording the occasion.
Do you think she was there going, isn't it ghastly? Or do you think she was
This is
what they thought of these places they were
It's
open?
a massively optimistic kind of moment, this. And well, one thing that they built, which you may see footage of, was they also, for these flats, they built a separate multi-story building called an auto stacker, which was like a thing where you would drive your car in and it would sort of take it automatically upstairs and then through, a series of conveyors, park it automatically. The problem was when they demoed it on this day that she came down, the first car that they put in just jammed the system and it never worked again. And they demolished it within a year or two.
That sounds so good as well. I'd love to see that working.
Yeah, the Woolwich Auto Stacker. Look it up.
I have to give it to Princess Margaret, right? She was the absolute workhorse of the royal family. I have seen so many buildings with this plaque on there. I used to work in a building.
What do you think all the gin and the fags were for?
she must have got around in it. So she must have done nothing but open buildings for
more ways than one.
30 years.
She was the best looking one as well, wasn't she? She was a bit saucy.
Woods in the chat.
Was that saucy or horsey, Horace? I
said she was a bit saucy, but she was the best looking one of the.
I hear those two things often go together. But anyway.
Well, sure. Yeah.
I was just starting my career in the 60s, and I distinctly remember the mood of optimism, the amount of money that was available, that was being spent on construction. New techniques were being tried. There was a lot of talk about plot ratios and how much per place it was costing, how quickly people were going to be rehoused in these.
Sorry to stop it again, Simon, but this is kind of a criticism, isn't it? Having the guy interviewed with the building,
with the ruination. Yeah. I mean, I love this guy. He's kind of, if anybody's ever seen the BBC drama Edge of Darkness, he really reminds me of Bob Peck, who plays the lead role, who is also a kind of classic, taciturn, well-built Yorkshireman, and you can see in his face there's this mixture of kind of, bafflement and disappointment that he carries, but he deploys his language in this very precise way. And this is this thing you've got throughout this show, is these engineers and town architects who were just kind of cut out the loop in terms of expertise.
New blocks, and I think people were swept along by the euphoria of the time.
Her Majesty, accompanied by the Duke of Edinburgh, arrives to open a new housing development in the Gorbals of Glasgow. She met members of the Housing Committee who are responsible for the new facelift.
can only imagine Philip's comments when he went to some of these places. What are they doing to the country?
This is 1972, and this is a major development. This is called. This is called Hutchison Town Area E. I mean, it's literally like a name out of Clockwork Orange. Municipal flat block 18A, linear north, and this was an enormous project, which very, very quickly fell into disrepair. These flats were nicknamed the Dampies as a result of all the water penetration and the condensation and mold that went through the buildings. I mean, there's a long sort of history to this stuff. It was built in 72. I mean, eventually, I think it was the late 80s. It was demolished after having been more or less vacated and then taken over by junkies. But they said by sort of 1975, people were saying that the damp has now reached an overpowering level. Black mold is prevalent on the upper floors and black and green mold on the lower floors. Tint beetles infest the complex as they feed off the fungus. Possessions like clothes smell, food not in the fridge goes off, and residents are deeply unhappy. 400 people protest about the flats and are outraged when the newly formed Glasgow District Council claims it is down to heavy breathing and condensation as opposed to damp. In the end, they admit the buildings are at fault and they propose a £2 million overhaul. It gets to the point where there's water running down the walls. There are maggots breeding in the carpet. This is, by 1981, called the most modern and expensive ghost town in the world. We haven't even worked out the cost to remedy the dampness. This drags on through the 80s, and the place just eventually becomes, a home for drug addicts and all sorts of stuff. It was absolutely awful. By 1989, the locals were removed at this point, and they say they don't want yuppie flats there. They start a regeneration project eventually, and it gets demolished in about 1990.
So, sorry, people lived in the damp for, 20, 30 years?
Well, I think a lot of people moved out or had to be rehoused because there was a lot of health problems associated with it. So, I mean, the Gorbals obviously is an area of Glasgow has been notoriously poor and troubled, for decades. But this was kind of offered as the remedy, and it was probably even worse. I mean, interestingly, people have raised comments saying, well, not all of the housing that went before was that bad. And that is, there was bad housing, and it is true to some extent. Also that some of the things like the tenements, I mean, I spoke to a lady from Glasgow who she'd lived in tenements, and she said, actually, structurally, they were brilliant. Today they'd be tarted up, gentrified, and be sold off and get a very healthy price. Some of them were good, compared to the sorts of structures that you're seeing here.
Just having a little bit of damp or fungus in your house is really bad for your health, let alone having it fucking dripping down the walls and stuff, and like damp carpet. Oh my god, I can't believe it. I can't believe people manage to live like that even for a few years.
Maggots in the carpet.
Maggots. But I wanted to ask, you mentioned Clockwork Orange and you likened it to things in Clockwork Orange. Was some of that shot in places like this? Because it looks like... Right.
That was Thamesmead in London, yeah. But it was just the name, Hutchison Town Area E is what this was called. And it just...
kind of reminds me of that later, that film with, what's the one with the girl in it who shoots the Hunger Games?
Yeah.
In Hunger Games, they're all in their different I'm wondering if Hunger Games is actually just like all of these dystopian fictions that we think of. It's literally like Jess Britain. Jess Britain since 1945.
The interesting thing to the aesthetics of A Clockwork Orange is that it's because it's kind as if this sort of vision that they had worked, because the likes of the Gorbals or whatever they would call it in Glasgow, they had like pubs. The ones in Killinworth had this as well. So you could have this whole complex, and it will be the skywalks connecting it. But then you could get in the lift, and you could go all the way down, and you could go underground, and there'd be like a bar, and the different blocks would go down and connect under the ground. And it was as if it was all designed so that you'd never have to go out in the real world. You could go down to the pub and pick up, meet somebody, pick up a chick, and then go along the walkway and back up to your own place and all of this kind of thing. And Clockwork Orange has got a lot of that kind of looks and aesthetics to it. And it's as if it's a critique of the vision if it had become real, instead of just sort of molding away as soon as it was built.
just kind of imagine it like kind of underground mole people. Like imagine they'd built like kind of after a while you'd evolve because you've never actually seen daylight before because you've spent all your life in underground high-rise tunnels.
There was lots of places in Newcastle where they had pubs built into the concrete brutalism. And so all you would see would be like a pub. There was one at next to Monument under Eldon Square, the St. George's, and it was next to there was a big monument there, and they used to call it Hippie Square because all of the goths and the heavy metal kids would hang around that square. So everyone just called it Hippie Square. But then there would be like a little hole in the wall with St. George and the Dragon. That was the pub, and you would go inside. It had no windows or anything. It was just, but it was a decent bar. Like I went there.
Yeah, I'll thank one of our watchers, Nova Castrian, who sent some tweets yesterday talking about the way these places were self-contained. And I think in that place at Killingworth, he was talking about the fact they had a library, there was a doctor's surgery, there was a dentist, there was what he's called an early superstore, Woolco. I don't know that particular name.
I went to the doctor's.
There you go.
Yeah, at Killingworth. So you would enter Killingworth. You would go under, depending on where you came from. I'm going to be careful of being doxing, but surrounding Killingworth would be a bunch of subways going under the roads. But then the path of the subway that went under the road, it would keep going up and up, and you'd be walking like, say, 30 meters above the ground, and then it would split off and go all the way through the different blocks. But there was a central one that would take you all the way to the shopping centre, and the shopping centre would be on high, and then there was a pub there as well, and it was all like little. It was like, you know, like the Shire where it's like little circular holes. It was like that, but instead of it being like bucolic rolling hills, it was solid concrete.
Yeah, and that was an idea from Smith. He wanted to do this kind of level separation between pedestrians and traffic. It's like separating people from production in a weird way.
I don't know if you guys wanted to see. I'll just share my screen a second. But there's this this kind of website called Architects Journal, where they've got the mocked up plans of the brutalist vision for Newcastle, right? And this is kind of what they had in mind. Look, it's like a kind of futuristic city. You got your co-op there. You've got a nice communist supermarket, like coffee pot. You know, you've got all your escalators going down. You know, that's what it actually looked like in real life. But
yeah, there were banks, there were bakers, he says, greengrocers, butchers. There was a sports centre with a swimming pool. There was a boating lake nearby. In fact, 2 lakes, he says. And there was some schools in there as well. And as Morgoth said, that they had transport infrastructure like express buses into Newcastle and walkways into the kind of what he calls the Citadel area.
They also had, so you had the main like flats, but then you also had a massive housing estate, and it was built in a similar weird prefabricated style, and they call that the Goths. And the Goths are still there. They got done up, I think, but they had flat roofs on them. So you had these white prefabricated houses, a few square miles of them, again with all of the walkways and everything. And then what people call them in the surrounding villages of North Tyneside, where it was more normal, they used to call it Jerusalem. Because, you know, when you see the old biblical movies and it's just white houses with like flat roofs, that's what it looked like. It was a kind of brutalist Jerusalem.
That was characteristic of what they called skarn construction, which was a Scandinavian. I mean, a lot of this was influenced by the kind of social urban planning that took place in Scandinavia and was kind of transplanted perhaps unrealistically to Britain. But the scarn was a sort of popular, cheap way of doing it, where you could just do things like brick sidewalls, and then you would have the concrete panels in the front and maybe the back. You would have some timber construction to, give it a bit of air of, the brutalism when it was conceived, that it would have sort of natural materials in it. And also one of the problems with the scarn, of course, was they put asbestos in the walls for fire protection. So which is why a lot of these places now have to be either knocked down or rejigged.
I'm always sorry, like looking at some of these sites where they're kind of sort of celebrating brutalism. I'm always kind of slightly suspicious of there was an exhibition on not that long ago called Concrete Dreams, Rethinking Newcastle's Brutalist Past.
Yeah.
Talking about how there was a dream to build a prosperous and egalitarian city through pioneering architecture. Is this kind of this is actually on right now? It's actually running until
June 1st.
We should go, Simon. We should all go.
Yeah.
Let's
go to
the Brutalist Concrete Dreams.
Yeah. I mean, it arouses a lot of very fierce, feeling in people, brutalism. Basically, a lot of this in Britain was done by a couple called the Smithsons, Peter and Alison Smithson. And brutalism, the name really comes from the phrase béton brut, which is raw concrete. And one of the kind of things that they said, it was not so much an aesthetic as an ethic. So they tried to have a kind of like a social honesty in the way things were constructed. And they talk about, the sandiness of the sand that's used and the woodiness of the wood. It was kind of an attempt to be utilitarian and direct and honest, but to be absolutely even more stripped back than Corbusier's modernism, which obviously to us nowadays, looks very chic in some ways, from a design point of view. People like, Jonathan Meades, who did that program on brutalism that Morgoth retweeted recently, he lives in one of Corbusier's buildings, the famous one, l'Unité d'Habitation. And what the Smithsons were, obviously, they were deeply, imbued with socialist ideals. And their ethos, they said, was to drag a rough poetry out of the confused and powerful forces which are at work in this kind of redevelopment architecture. And they were trying to be sort of honest and functional as they saw it. It says they tried to face up to a mass production society. That was a sort of again, but as an ethic is all very well, but is it something you can live in?
Yeah, the Meades documentary on YouTube is called Concrete Poetry, and he takes the view that it was everybody was just too stupid and small-minded to understand how wonderful it all was. He's got this amazingly snobby, elitist approach to it all, which is just a joy to watch. And he kind of looks down his nose at twee Edwardian buildings with pretend wooden rafts in them, and he just says it's all shite, it's all rubbish. What you had, the dream was laid out in front of you in the 60s, and you hated it because you couldn't understand it because you're all just too stupid.
This building here tends to be cited as an example of where it went right, Simon. This building,
it's a battleship, isn't it? It's
like it looks like a ship, yeah.
That could sit in Warhammer 40k or something, couldn't it?
And apparently, this is still in Newcastle. This building here, you can see it's been UKized for us. Look, they've stuck a Five Guys in there, and there's office space to rent in the top part. Look, but
there you go. The grit in the oyster that makes the pearl.
Every cloud has a UK lining. Has anyone heard the phrase "cities in the sky" before?
Yeah,
is that may be mentioned in the documentary?
Streets in the sky, yeah.
Streets in the sky, yeah. As part of the vision for these things as well. Like what Morgoth described, you just find yourself ascending to somewhere that's 30 meters above ground, and you're in a street somehow. Something like that, something resembling a street. And yeah, that was part of the vision of these things. People would be able to conduct their lives potentially above ground level,
Yeah.
If their job was up there as well.
And that idea of vertical transplantation just ignored the fact that the sort of set of social relations changes when you do that as well, when you divorce it from, the ground level landscape.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm coming across all sorts of websites and things basically campaigning not to knock these buildings down. Like this one, for example, right? This, I mean, look at it. It looks like something from like a horror movie or something to me. But like, it's almost like they want to save the idea of this failed socialist dream. It's weird. Why do they want to save this stuff?
Because they're socialists, aren't they?
Yeah.
One of the first Twitter accounts I ever followed about 2012 or something, and it's still going. I think it's the same one. It's This Brutal House is the name of it. It's at Brutal House. It's just plainly pro-brutalist, just loving pictures. Really fine photography in some cases, but like just loving pictures of brutalist architecture every day and just defending it, and fan pictures and stuff. There's a school of thought that wants to preserve it. There's one particular building in London it's like a housing estate again. It was it's grade 1 listed. It's really, really protected. And there's others as well. There's one brutalist building near Abbey Road that I've seen. It's just unbelievable. It's like that one you posted a minute ago that looks like a warship. It's like that, all those weird angles and stuff. And it's like, you did this to be ugly. That's deliberately ugly. But some people actually, they're socialists, especially. They love that.
I've just found that account. This Brutal House for us, followed by Ash Sakar.
Right. I used to follow it. But in all seriousness, some of these people do defend this as a high watermark of their side's power.
There's something that's, I was saying yesterday on a tweet that, there's the people who live in, the top, flight examples of this, I suppose, in London are places like the Barbican, where it's nearly £1 million a flat and the walls are about a foot thick. So you're very kind of protected in this enclave. But I get the sense the sort of people who are going to spend that sort of money on a flat in the Barbican are going to be what David Goodhart calls the anywhere people, who are going to be people who live in a very interior way. They're kind of somewhat, you get the sense, abstracted from, the concerns of what's happening on street level. And so you feel it's kind of suited to those kinds of people in a sense who perhaps are very often, not particularly community minded as such. They're very idealistic in their projections, but you don't get the idea that they relish actually being connected to people. It's quite an isolated way of living, even if, yes, the apartments are kind of gleaming and well appointed and they let in the sunlight in a very sort of picturesque photographic way. But does that actually meaningfully constitute home, or again, just storage?
This one I put on the screen, I wonder if some of those pubs that Morgoth was talking about were built like that.
Flat top pub.
Underneath. Is that?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Blakelaw Social Club was especially rough like that.
If anyone
no place like home. No? Look at that one. No place like home. Bloody hell!
That's a prison. That is a fucking prison. That TV series. This is there was a movie as well, but the TV series This Is England. You see people go out for a night in a place. It's like definitely contained within a wholly 60s system built estate. There's a whole, little shopping centre, pub, fish and chip shop, and all this, all in some underground thing. No windows, like Morgoth said. You see an example of that in one of the episodes of This Is England as well. The pub is underground.
That block there is in Middlesbrough, apparently. If you want to pay it a visit.
You mentioned the Smithsons. They were one of them was from Stockton, Teesside, right?
From the northeast. Yeah.
And the other famous brutalist couple was the Lasdons, wasn't it? Dennis Lasdon and his wife, Dennis and Julie Lasdon.
Yes.
They designed the National Theatre.
That's it, the National. Yeah.
Infamously ugly brutalist National Theatre. And they were of the other. The Smithsons were socialists. The Lasdons were socialists of the the Abrahamic extraction.
It was a real day to remember for the Johnston family.
I think it was a general thing. I think architects, structural engineers, central government particularly, central government were very keen to encourage local authorities to build using industrialised techniques so that the main components could be made inside warm, comfortable factories.
Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon made it a day they'll never forget.
Sometimes it was only months after the excitement of the royal opening But the tenants found out what it was really like to live in system-built blocks.
The Princess and her
Their flats ran with water from condensation inside and from leaks outside. Eventually, many councils gave up on piecemeal repairs. They began to evacuate the tenants and demolish the blocks. So far, 10,000 flats have been knocked down, some of them only 15 years old. Thousands more await the same fate. Who is to blame for the scale of the present problem?
Well, it's very difficult, I think, to put blame on anyone. It is due to what we call innovation without development. Now, the pressure is on the designer, the architect, to provide the building that the client wants within the money that is available. Now, if he's going to try and do that, he wants to build it as cheaply as he can within the shortest possible time. So he's under pressure to innovate to try and achieve this. And the more you innovate without development, the greater are the risks. We have to compare this with other design situations like aircraft or products or cars, where there is considerable research and development before they are mass produced. And this, of course, is reasonable, because if you mass produce something and it fails, the consequences are enormous. Well, as far as buildings are concerned, most buildings, except for housing, are one-off. And if one fails, the consequences are less of a problem. But in mass-produced housing, as prefabricated housing, you may have thousands, and if there's a fault in them, there may be thousands of faults. And people didn't realize that unless you do the proper research and development, these enormous risks exist.
The implication of that is really that the system building blocks were tested out on local authority tenants.
Well, yes. I mean, the early examples were really, I suppose, the development situation of let's build some and see what happens. But that's a very costly way of actually undertaking development.
It's a very unfortunate way for the tenants as well, isn't it?
Very, yes.
The tenants, they were and are victims of circumstances which were abominable. I spent 3 years in prison in conditions that were as good as some of the ones that they were put to live in. They were never, ever designed...
Let's just reflect on that. It's a little bit rich for Smith to be saying they were victims of circumstances. They were victims of circumstances that he was lining his pockets with.
And he gets a bit pious about the prison conditions being better as well. Why are you saying that?
Yeah, he made millions. He made millions off Paulson, at least £2 million in today's money. In addition, he was getting he was doing advising for the Labour Party at this time, in coming up to the '64 election when he was in power. He got 1.5 million just off them, just to do consulting. So to talk about victims of circumstances, I think is just...
Sorry, what? Consulting on system-built housing?
No, on Labour strategy in the north. His PR firm was hired. Roughly £1.5 million in today's money. Yeah.
Oh, today's... Sorry, right.
Yeah.
Labour what was that? Oh, you have to pay off this guy, bribe that guy over there. I mean, what was the advice he was?
It was just to sell the Labour Party in the '64 election. That was really all it was. It was a number of different northern councils that they wanted approaching, and Smith's PR company managed a lot of that, and he was paid handsomely for it. That's all one can say.
The interview that Simon sent me, where it was Smith, and they showed him footage of some fella who lived in one of these high-rise things, and they interviewed him, and he was like, look at the state of it. I'm just sick of my life. The water's coming down the walls, the wallpaper's falling off, I'm breathing in like mold, I feel as sick as a dog, I'm depressed, it's just horrible. and they put the clip back to Smith, and he says he's just nostalgic for a time that did. he's just nostalgic for a time that never really happened, and he says he's complaining.
Fucking hell, man.
You see, what he's not telling you is that his mother might have died at 53 if I didn't get him out of that other place. There's lots of people out there who are quite happy with how things turned out. It's that line. You're just nostalgic for a time that never happened, and he's lying there. You know, I know this firsthand. Like if you've got to deal with mold, one of the things you can do to dehumidify the place is get like a bucket of salt, because salt pulls moisture in and out of the air, which says a lot about the kinds of places I've lived. So you'll be sitting there with buckets of salt all over the place to try and drag the dampness out of the air, and he's got him saying he's nostalgic for a place that never really existed.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of euphemism around this stuff when people brought these issues up. I mean, like I said about the case in Glasgow, and the council tried to say it was just heavy breathing that was causing the problem, you know, and they were filling these buildings, you know, with asbestos. I mean, in typical 60s style, they gave it a fancy name, you know, like they called it asbestolux. You know, but that was the way you kind of branded it in the 60s. You put lux on the end, like Electrolux, and it made it seem modern and safe. But that was kind of exactly what was happening. They were, you know, poisoning people very slowly in various ways.
Living in damp is awful. Where I lived about 20 years ago, I just let a little bit of something set in behind one of the chest of drawers. Somehow, some damp got in behind the wall, on the wall. And I got rid of it, so it wasn't too bad. But just breathing that in made me chesty for about a week afterwards. Just breathing in a few mouthfuls of the air that had been in that damp. That was a tiny patch of damp. Well, just a little patch of damp on one wall. We're talking about people where it's in the whole, every room. It's like it's running, literally dripping down the walls and stuff. That's nightmarish. You'd rather live outside. That's terrible.
It's just a massive problem. It's just a massive problem with British construction generally. I mean, I tried a couple of winters ago when power costs were going up. I tried, you know, the old thing people, your dad says to you, you know, or switch the heating off and put a jumper on. So I tried that for the whole winter of having the heating off and just wearing a bit more clothes. And yeah, I was fine from the point of view of I could stay a bit warmer. But the problem with the British house is you can't just turn the heating off because the damp then really starts to cut in. And you know, my bathroom was looking pretty bad. So you know, and I, like you, just got chesty from it. So I just thought you can't just toughen up, you know, and turn the heating
you start
off.
Wheezing and you get a funny cough that doesn't go away. It's just, and that's from a little bit of damp. Like I can't imagine living with a
you
house.
guys just have a nostalgia for a time.
Oh, sorry, yeah. It's my imperial nostalgia.
Nostalgia for tuberculosis, and
that's why I voted for Brexit, by the way.
Bring back industrial diseases.
Multi-story flats for families. They were never designed to throw hundreds of people together, close in proximity, block to block, without open space.
Yes,
they were not designed for those purposes, and the fact that they were used for them is responsible for so much human misery that I thank.
What were they designed for then?
That's exactly what they were designed for. That was the point.
The Lord that I had nothing to do with any of that kind of system building.
What do you think they were designed for?
Making money, and they made money in abundance. It was the best time that the contracting industries ever had.
Oh, that's all right then.
Cheeky bastard.
Unbelievable. Cojones on him.
Yeah.
But the real dangers of system building are only just beginning to emerge. Many were built like houses of cards. The blocks have no central frame. Instead, their whole strength rests on the bolts and fixings between the concrete panels. As councils demolish their blocks, they're finding that in many cases, those connections are just not there.
Well, some of the joints are barely jointed together. If they should have been held on by 3 or 4 inches, in some of the places they're probably 1 inch or 2 inch. With the slightest movement of the walls and the floors, it causes a collapse.
I just am amazed at what is found when we examine these buildings today sometimes. I think that I could go beyond bolts and fixings of that kind. We have found serious deficiencies of the knitting of reinforcement. We have been astounded to find how often that reinforcement was never knitted together. It required, I think, an intelligence or a sense of care that was often missing on sites.
One of the main attractions of system building was the contractor's claim that the blocks could be put up quickly by unskilled.
Pause, please. Well, this just reminds me of like a lot of things that you hear coming out of communist countries, like where things are basically, I don't know if that's exactly the case here, but when things are fitted to, made according to political orders, often quotas and targets and stuff, we need to house this many people, that's what we're doing. Quality comes second, right? Like if it, in the Soviet Union, it was like if you're required to produce this much tonnage of concrete or whatever. The ways of doing that, if it was too difficult, was to produce the tonnage but not the quality, right? I was just trying to think to myself, like, how do people involved at the construction stage, the parts, bring themselves to let things leave the factory, which they know might fall apart. We're talking about buildings, right? Not toys. How it is that gets done is basically the bosses are corrupt, right? That comes from the top, doesn't it? Often the workmen would not be happy to put that out, but the bosses are telling them, we're putting that out today, even if it's shit. This is what happens when politicians have too much power, and obviously they're incentivized and bribed by slimy bastard businessmen as well. But it's just, I associate this with state planning, really.
When I was a kid, I had to do it. When I left school, I did a plastering course in North Shields, and because my dad didn't want us doing nothing, so he basically just dragged us down to the Dole and told them to put me on the first course that came along. I had no say in it or anything. I just wanted to ride my bike for the summer, but so I ended up doing it. Now, what had happened was, if you remember the whole joyriding thing in the early 90s, the people in the chavas, as they were called then, before they were called chavs, they were called chavas up around our way, and they were stealing cars, and there was eventually you got these massive riots, and North Shields went up in flames. So I was doing this training course for plastering. It was on a construction thing, Wimpy. And there was a bricklaying section, there was a plumbing section, there was a plastering section, and it was completely full of tow rags and scumbags from all over the Northeast who had all been involved with rioting and burning the place down. And I was on the plastering one. There was like about 6 bouncers from nightclubs in Whitley Bay, and each of us had these what they called a bay, which was like a fake room, and you would learn your different plastering techniques and stuff like that. And the instructor was called Dave, and he was from Middlesbrough, somewhere. And these were dangerous fellas. These were scary fellas. And their plastering was absolute shite, like absolute shit. And what they did, I remember distinctly, he'd come round, Dave was this little fella with a cig hanging out of his mouth all the time. And he came round, and there was a big bouncer from Whitley Bay called Geordie Chambers, who was really famous. And the plaster, the finishing plaster was just dropping off and just kind of like it was just running down the instructor's face. His clipboard was just full of it. And he kind of put his arm around him and he says, "That's all right, isn't it, Dave?" And Dave looked up and there was like a glob of plaster fell off the ceiling and went into his eye. But he was so shit scared to like not let him pass. He just went, aye, Geordie, that's spot on that. And he just ticked all the boxes. So that bum went out onto a building site. He would have just carried on. And I remember there was a little fella. I was lucky because I got this middle-aged fella, and he was watching all of this going on. These absolute cowboys getting sent out onto the construction sites. And he used to look at the finish and he says, bye. that finishing plaster, that hides a multitude of sins, doesn't it? Because what would be underneath would be even worse. And if you could just punch it and the whole thing would come off the wall. And all of these cowboys got sent out onto the main sites to do stuff like that.
Labour was all part of the design of the system, and to get the flats built more quickly, the contractors used piecework and bonus schemes. The faster you put the bolts in, the quicker you got them up, and the more everyone earned. If the bolt didn't fit into the bolt hole, what used to happen?
Well, you probably get one or two, and if you got a couple in, that would sort of hold it as this.
Oh, bloody hell.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
Homes fit for heroes.
Zoomed, and that was it.
In terms of the sort of crucially important bits, like where, you know, one panel's meeting another and you've got bolts and you've got fixings that are meant to hold those panels in position, how often was that work done properly?
Not very often. It varies from job to job, but not very often. I dare say if you went back now and dug some cement out, you'd find holes there where the bolts should be.
I mean, when that...
It was quite a common thing. I mean, it wasn't unusual. I mean, who's going to bother putting 4 bolts in when you can get away with 2?
If you couldn't get them in, sometimes they...
All right, I'm a bit embarrassed. I said a moment ago that the workers probably wanted to do a proper job and they weren't allowed, but I seem to have been completely wrong. They're kind of smiling about it, if anything. Fucking hell. Ugh.
Walk in. Another time you'd have to spend anything up to 20 minutes, half an hour to get them in.
If you wanted to avoid spending that half hour, what was the alternative?
Cut them off.
What proportion of bolts were missing and what proportion were put in?
I would say about 80% were missing and about 20% put in.
That's the stat that shocked me. You know, they're just held together by their own weight in the tan and green. Yeah, yeah.
That was your view after sort of spending a couple of years being in a very good position to see what was going on?
Yes, yes.
I mean, now that these buildings are being demolished, like the one behind you, the engineers are finding that a very large proportion of those crucial bolts and ties are not in position. Does that mean you were not doing your job properly?
I would imagine that somebody wasn't doing their job properly if the bolts were not there. Then, in the first instance, the contractor wasn't doing his job properly because that's what he's paid to do. And secondly, the supervision that the contractors are employing is supposed to be seeing to the same thing.
This is why this guy is the chief, right? He can lie through his teeth without batting an eyelid, whereas all the other douchebags owned up straight away. Yeah, we did half a job. You know, this guy, everybody else's fault, not mine. That's why he got promoted right up to the top. Look.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I would say that the Clockworks has a responsibility.
If the structural security of the whole thing is determined by every bolt being in and being tightened up properly, the answer is you would have to have a very high degree of site supervision. Because, you see, if a man on site finds that the bolt doesn't go in because the hole that was cast in situ doesn't line up with the hole in the prefabricated, he's not going to stop and make it fit. He'll just ignore it and press on because he's under pressure of speed of construction.
As you talk to your sort of workmates and things, I mean, it was just common knowledge that the fixings and the bolts were not going in as they should do.
Oh yeah, it was a joke. It was a joke.
Pause for a second.
The joke is wearing rather thin.
Just looking ahead at the 1.5 million new and I'm sure much better homes coming under Angela Rayner, the construction workers will no doubt be of a higher standard than these guys. So don't worry. You know, in say Egypt or Kenya, construction is known to be of a higher standard. So we can look forward with confidence.
For the 2,500 tenants living in this large system-built complex in Hume, Manchester. Their flats are plagued with damp, and the side of this large concrete walkway recently fell off. Council engineers then began to examine a number of flats and found that many of the bolts meant to be holding the large gable panels in position were not there. Anticipating that.
How did they even stay up?
Just their own weight, basically. So
incredible.
obviously there'd be a massive tonnage of weight depressing down on the panels, but that was the point, which we'll see in a minute. There would obviously, if certain things happen, the structural weakness is compromised, and because of the weight, it'll lead to disaster.
There might be some problems with the new systems. The government had set up the National Building Agency in the early 1960s. One of its main jobs was to check that the blocks were being properly assembled. Its managing director was Cleve Barr, a long-standing advocate of industrialised building methods. If you found examples of bolts and nuts and things, fixings not being done, I mean, shoddy workmanship on a site.
Yes.
Did you report that sort of thing?
Yes, we did find that, and the firms concerned would say they were stepping up the supervision and correcting it. It couldn't happen again, sort of thing.
What was your next step if they said that?
Well, within the capacity of trying to cope with an enormous number of work going on, we would look at it again if that were possible.
There were no sanctions you could impose?
None at all. None at all.
So the watchdog role was really a very hollow one, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
A few years ago,
Yeah, you only missed 80% of the bolts that were meant to be there. I mean, bloody hell.
I mean, if you look up the duties of the clerks of works, I mean, it's absolutely the case that they're supposed to ensure compliance, quality control, do site inspections, all the kind of stuff you would expect. And in Cleve Barr's position, I suppose he's at that level of bureaucracy which is completely removed and toothless. So you do begin to see that on the one hand, I mean, he was a sort of diehard socialist. You know, he was a man who is interestingly framed there in that Curtis way as he's not on a building site. He's in the back. He's in his back garden in his lovely leafy home in Walton-on-Thames, where he retired to. But you'll see some funny reaction from him later. It comes kind of out of a sense of responsibility and a sense of impotence at the same time. That the bureaucratic mechanism for keeping these guys away from calling time on these systems was a key part of the managerialism that led to this disaster.
Of a proper watchdog during the assembly of the system blocks was especially crucial. As each floor was completed, the connections and metal straps between the panels that were to hold the whole building together were sealed over by concrete being poured into the joints.
industrialized building methods are as expensive as bricks and mortar.
Today, the only way to discover what is missing is to hack out that same concrete. Sometimes the buildings may start that process themselves. Tenants in this block in Hammersmith, West London, have reported cracks opening up between the walls and floors. We asked the former president of the Institute of Structural Engineers, Tom Ackroyd, to look at the problem.
Are any of these buildings still there, Simon?
God knows. I mean, there were so many. There were thousands built. I suspect a lot of them have been demolished, but it's not a figure that I have in the researches that I did. But what he's describing here is what people call concrete cancer, where things like the water ingress into the concrete rots the steel rebar inside, and then the concrete is compromised and starts to fall away.
Simon, sorry, when you said you weren't sure, AA, were you asking about tower blocks built in this, the system built things?
Well, those ones that in Hammersmith, for example, are they
Because there are tower blocks. There's tower blocks all over Greater London.
There were tens of thousands of these.
Right, I always remember, I used to commute into London every day, and there's a horrible bit just outside Waterloo, on the Reading Waterloo line. As you come in, you see. I mean, they're all still there now, I think.
Yeah, a lot of money has been spent on remedial works. That's true. So a lot of them will still be there.
Yeah, I live in outer Greater London, and just in my borough, there's loads of tower blocks. I don't know if they're specifically built by these methods in this time, but tower blocks are everywhere in Greater London, and they're hideous. And I don't know if they've got these damp problems and stuff, though. I don't see bits falling off them. They might have been built later to better standards or something. I'm not sure.
They do a lot of external bolting these days, I think, to try and keep them in. But if you see these kind of preformed concrete slab blocks, there's a very great likelihood that they were system builds. And there were varying levels, if you like, of quality of system.
Yes, well, what we have here is the concrete being broken out to
show or not show, as the case may be, where there should be any fixings and straps. There should be straps connecting the panel to the floor. Simple straps, not very large or complicated, but just enough to hold the panels in. They are missing. Certainly we know that in other flats there are straps missing, which straps that should come out to hold the panels in, and since there aren't straps in more than one place, it suggests that there could be a number of places where straps ought to be and they're not.
What in fact is holding that wall panel in position?
It's probably there should be a connection, a bolted connection, which is a hidden connection. The problem with the system, you see, from the point of view of that we're doing now is checking it, is to find the bolts and the connections. You can't get at the bolts and connections, you can't see them, so you can't assure yourself if you're inspecting the building, yes, they're all right. That's the worrying part of the whole problem.
Now, since these things were made in a factory, and since the contractors, or the people who made them, told us with great pride that an 18-foot panel made in their molds would be accurate to plus or minus 3 millimeters, it never occurred to us that these bushes would not in fact fit over the boats. But it's perfectly clear now from what we hear, what's been found, that in fact they didn't always. Now, I don't know why this is so.
The panel didn't come made properly. For instance, 2-ton concrete floor slabs that was supposed to sit on 6 inches probably sat on 1 inch, something like that.
There should have been a 6-inch overlap.
That's right. And in some cases there was as little as 1 inch. Any movement at all, and they would just collapse.
Well, there were panels that arrived on the site with the reinforcing bars too proud against the wall of the concrete.
What happened to those panels?
Well, some of them were rejected by us, and then we were told they'd been passed at the work, so they were to be used.
Was it ever explained to you that it was important that the metal was kept away from the surface?
Yes, I think we were told that it was important, but time was an important factor, and if there is a skipload of concrete hovering over your head and some of the plastic isn't in place, then you go ahead and lower the skip down and pour the concrete.
The results of this slapdash approach to the making of reinforced concrete is now showing up in blocks of flats across the country. Rainwater penetrates the walls, and wherever the metal reinforcement is too near the surface, it rusts, expands, and forces off large pieces of concrete. In some cases, the whole structure is beginning to crumble.
The problem of the reinforcement rusting and chunks of concrete about so big coming off blocks of properties. It's a problem even on a low-rise block, a block that's only 3 or 4 stories high. If you're talking about blocks this size falling off the outside of tall tower blocks, 12, 13 stories up, often in high winds when they become dislodged, then it's a very serious problem.
How often did panels come that weren't the right size or shape or didn't have the right things projecting out of them?
Oh, it's difficult to say if any of them came the right shape or the right size.
You'd almost say that more came the wrong size than the right size.
I'd almost say that all of them came the wrong size.
For 3 12-story blocks of flats at Rugby, the precast concrete...
This promotional film, which shows a block being built by the Bison system, is a unique record. Unbeknown to the cameraman, he was filming damaged panels being fitted into the building.
...is swung up, it's dropped into its place to fit like a piece in a jigsaw puzzle.
But that wasn't all. Council engineers have now discovered that much of the metal reinforcement supposed to knit the panels together was not put in by the workers on the site. It has cost the council more than £500,000 per block just to make them safe.
To lay out a factory, in other words.
Altogether, more than 50,000 flats were built using the Bison wall frame system. As with all the other systems, a series of factories was set up to produce the large panels. These were then placed one on top of another to make the outside walls of the blocks. The structure of those panels was simple. 2 layers of concrete separated by insulating material and held together by metal ties.
What we have found in Birmingham is that in some situations the number of ties that should exist aren't there, and also that in many situations.
Is it that hard to just lay some bricks? Like why can't they just build a wall? Why do they have to do all this? They're just trying to do it on the cheap, basically. Is
just speed and efficiency in bureaucratic terms.
The wrong material has been used for the ties. We've had to bolt back already a number of panels where we felt that were so few ties that we were in a risk situation. The reason for that is simple. We are the authority that had 2 panels fall from our high-rise blocks. And when that happens, it's a horrendous thing when you have a block of concrete, which is something in the order of 3 meters by 4 meters, falling down from the 10th floor. The obvious scare and concern that creates is considerable.
Yeah, but also it's the side of somebody's house. I mean,
yeah.
Just watching TV one day and the side of my house has fallen off.
Although it doesn't affect the structure, it clearly, in fact, could kill someone.
Using a special electronic scanning device, Birmingham Council has secretly surveyed the panels in all their bison blocks. They found that 11,000 were secured by ties made of the wrong metal. A further 3,500 had less than half the ties they should, and 83 had nothing holding them on at all and were being kept in position by their own weight. Other cities have the same problem. In Glasgow, a panel weighing 2 tons fell from the 5th story of this bison-built block. In an attempt to reassure their tenants, the council is bolting back all the panels.
Decorative facings of factory
I'd be reassured. Hell.
made mosaic are laid onto concrete walls to relieve the
The
monotony.
problem of bad workmanship in the construction of panels was not confined to bison. The National Building Agency sent inspectors to many factories making parts for the systems.
The output of the 10 men operating the
Often
precast
we go to a factory and find that the insulation, which is supposed to be in the middle of a sandwich panel, was floating on top, or the steel was too near the surface, or something like that. One would report it to the management, and they would say that they were correcting it. We made confidential reports from the ministry on most of our visits and so forth.
If those reports were adverse, what then happened?
Well, the people concerned were told to improve it.
And then were there checks to see if they had?
Well, as I say, the supervision of a contract was between the authority, which theoretically should have had a clerk of works in the factory as well as on the site. But there just weren't enough skilled staff. And I'm afraid a lot of it was taken for granted, rather.
When systems arrived on the scene, did you understand?
It's not exactly the spirit of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, this, is it? I mean, it's not like Britain's finest hour of excellence, this.
Understand them?
I was aware of what the system involved, but I couldn't say that I was perfectly knowledgeable on that particular type of construction. No, because it was a change from the traditional type of construction that I was used to.
I mean, given that this was an untried and untested type of building, given that the workers were on piece rates and bonuses, the lack of site supervision was clearly a crucial factor in things going wrong.
Oh, I think this is true. And I think this applies everywhere, that, defects we find now to a large degree are due to site supervision and should have been found. But, who is going to pay for this intensive amount of site supervision, you see? I think there's another problem, and that is the men on the site don't necessarily know the consequences of what they're doing. You see, I mean, if they miss something out, they are not aware of the structural implications of missing it out.
Did anybody ever...
I mean, come on. You're building a house. I just forgot some of the bolts, What could happen? What's the worst could happen? Yeah, the wall could fall off, mate. I mean, it's not... You don't really need, like, a PhD to figure that one out, do you?
they definitely must be aware that it would have some structural implications, even if they don't know exactly what they are. Ludicrous.
Well, you can see the problem that they've run into is that this whole endeavor is to bypass skilled tradesmen and artisans who take pride in their work. So what this does is create people who just don't care. I mean, it's, as they said, it's piecework. So you get paid by the bolt or by the screen wall or whatever it is, and by the fixing, or maybe you get it by how many walls per day you get put up. And so what this all does is squeeze out and bypass the man or the men who take pride in their work and know what they're doing. And then it has a knock-on effect that in order to compensate for the fact that you've got these men who are basically just a bunch of cowboys, you then need to have extra supervision and extra regulation on the top of that, which creates another problem, because then you have to make sure that's going to be supervised properly and then that isn't corrupted in some way, which happened here as well. And so it's kind of like all of these, the more they try to go for efficiency, the more regulation you need because people don't care. And it always kind of goes in the direction of like China. I know that's in a sort of in the process of being a trope of the past, but it all goes in this shoddy workmanship tat instead of men who take pride in their work. And this is like, you know, the story of the modern world, really.
And to add to that, I mean, the thing about China is, I mean, I don't know if you've seen in recent years, there have been a number of these stories about buildings in China, which, I mean, are falling apart. You know, they'd have been stronger if they'd been made of cheese, to be honest. You know, some of them are just, you know, concrete without even rebar inside.
And I was just going to say quickly, just there's another problem though, and that's when you've got a society of this mass and scale, it just isn't feasible anymore to have some kind of loving tradesman and craftsman put up a building for 1,000 people like this within 6 months. So mass and scale seems to necessitate and bypass just raw efficiency, which is these are the outcomes that you're going to get.
Looking at these construction workers they've interviewed here, I did wonder, did they actually deliberately hire guys in some sense like grey market employees or something, you know, like guys they knew were dodgy but were much cheaper, or they hired them because they would accept that, because the workmen would accept the lower standards. I wonder if there was an existing union who refused to do this work because they knew it was bad, something like that.
Well, it would be the kind of people that I was talking about before on the training thing. That's where they'd find work doing this kind of thing. And you may find that they just weren't unionized. It will be the tradesmen who were unionized, so they just bypass all of that.
Yeah.
And one of John Paulson's big things was he got in with the unions. People like what are now the GMB.
Well, like the theme of corruption among union bosses is very interesting as well, because there are unions like the taxi drivers in London, who insisted on standards, very high standards. You know, like if you get a black cab, he knows all the streets. It's not like an Uber driver, and you get certain other perks for the higher price. There are unions like that, and then there are unions who can be corrupted, maybe from the top down again. You know, because the boss was bought off. Obviously, in organised crime has often had relationship with unions and stuff. You know, so that is a factor. I do wonder if it's like what Morgoth said. They basically went to the sort of stay out of jail scheme guys, or you know, something like that.
It's the difference. There used to be apprenticeships, and then you had training schemes, and I think government decided, well, we can kind of increase the number of, say, plumbers by we'll get around all of that apprenticeships. The apprenticeships would usually be where it was an existing business, and then a young lad would leave school and he'd get taken on for 5 years by an older hand, and he'd also have like lessons and theory on top of all of that. The training schemes were basically, we can just budget. We can just kind of give you the basics and you can go on to the job. And then if you get it wrong, you'll be told what to do, again, to meet the needs of mass and scale.
to fill the quota for number of workers needed, you know.
Yeah.
Explained to you that it was pretty important to, follow the specifications closely.
Well, this is explained, but everything can be explained. It doesn't necessarily say that unless somebody's standing over your back, it's going to be followed.
Further evidence of what was...
I just wanted to add something else about workers as well. There has been disputes between unions and government in the past about like certain unions work in a effectively racist way, it was said, because they would be like jobs would be taught from father to son. The son was the apprentice, like not a state apprentice scheme, but literally like actually a very private union in a sense, Boilermakers in New York apparently were a famous example. They were very highly paid, very high working conditions, because they were needed, and they were often needed in an emergency, and just various conditions can make certain unions closed off, and they're very successful for their members. Their workers actually have quite a good life from the work they do. But it's also a reason for the state, when it has a project, to try and bypass them or undermine them or call them racist because they're passing job on from father to son, not to the new black guys coming in or whatever. And so I bet that it makes sense that this is actually a bypassing of the unions or the creation of new corrupt unions, which would like to fit the new post-war world. Whereas older I imagine workers in like say 100 years ago would not have. It varies a great deal, but a lot of workers would not have gone along with this stuff. They did have some pride in what they produced, but you have to create a new type of don't give a shit worker for stuff like this. Maybe I'm speculating, but it makes sense.
Allowed to go on during the 60s boom is supplied by the large Trowbridge estate in East London, built by the Cebus Moray system. Consulting engineers were called in after a torrent of complaints from the tenants.
We asked them to do detailed structural investigations because we're worried about continuing problems of penetrating water in the buildings. And when they carried out the opening up, they found that the buildings were structurally dangerous. Certainly 3 of them were. As a result, we've had to spend urgently £1 million on works to stabilise these 3 blocks to make them safe. When we looked at the drawings of the original construction and looked at the results of the opening up, we found that the 2 were not corroborated. That in fact the buildings were not built in accordance with the drawings. And also, from the way in which they were built, that there'd been no adequate supervision on the site, which led us to believe that all parts of these buildings were therefore suspect.
The engineers hacked back the concrete and found in flat after flat that the metal bars meant to hold the panels onto the building were just not there. At what point does a building like this become unsafe?
I don't know. It's a very difficult thing. One can't predict the life of a building like that. Accidents could occur. They could be literally almost instantaneous.
Do you know, Simon, watching this documentary and watching the one last week in 80s Italy, people talk about the fall of Western civilization. I often wonder, like, how was civilization ever built at all? Like, how did this is like this is not like Somalia now. This is Britain that we're watching here. How does anyone do anything? How does anything run? You know what I mean?
I mean, we're undergoing this, retraction of the state. I mean, thinking about the houses, the new builds that people complain about these days, and the horror stories you see about poor workmanship and so on. I mean, it bypasses that whole process of, public works and having, the clerk of works actually oversee these kinds of things. It's left now to the private sector, and it's on a kind of per job basis. And the only remedy at the end of the day is going to be litigation by someone who buys a house,
Wasn't
So
that
there's
Cleve
no
Bar guy
route.
the sort of? Wasn't that Cleve Bar guy like a chief overseer of works though?
Yeah,
This is
he was a sort of central government, overseer architect, but without the ability to do much about it. He did try to actually resist the contractor-led systems like this, and it did affect his reputation. But I mean, as he says, it does seem to have been a structural problem that he wasn't given the powers to do anything about it.
What happens down the line, though, when everything becomes like about litigation and so on and so forth, is that you end up with a scenario that everybody's just reluctant to do anything, right?
Yeah.
whether it's like, you know, the 15 nurses that you have to see one doctor at the NHS, those 15 nurses are there basically so the system doesn't accept any liability until you get to the doctor, right? Or in this case, like the other day, for example, the pressure keeps on going on my boiler, right? And so we had to call the boiler guy out. And the plumber said, listen, when this boiler guy comes, if he can't get to that boiler quickly, he'll charge you £100. He won't touch it. So I had to take all of the shelves out of the unit to make sure that this guy had space so that he'd actually do the job, because he wasn't going to do anything when he got there, type thing, you know? And it's just like, I have found basically dealing with tradesmen today now, you're always in a situation where they've got an eye on that. I can't do that, or I can't do this, or, you know, so you end up doing tons of stuff, you know, because there's this kind of culture of, well, I can't accept liability for that, or I can't do this, or, you know, health and safety says that, type thing. You know what I mean? So
yeah, it's a replacement of the old union thing of talking about, you know, demarcation, boss. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that, which has been effectively kind of privatized by building regulation, and therefore the attitude you're describing.
All the thing could carry on and on, but there is no way of putting a life to it. It would be a guess. I think as an engineer you have to err. If this is erring, if you don't know, you must caution, and you must play very, very safe, and therefore you have to say no and assume that there's an imminent danger of something happening. This block had to be repaired, and now that it has been repaired, I would say it is safe.
Did the contractors know what was going on?
I think so. As I say, I think they must have done. If they didn't, you know, then they'd no right doing the job, because that's, you know, purely bad supervision.
Everybody knew what was happening, and everybody just wanted to wash their hands of the responsibility of it.
We've talked to some workers, and a number of workers on different sites. I mean, they say it was almost a standing joke amongst them that the work wasn't being done properly. Yeah. So the workers seem to know. They say, in fact, the contractors must have been aware of it. Yeah. Your men were aware of it. You were aware of it. Why wasn't something done?
Well, I don't think anyone clearly saw the overall picture with that clarity. I mean, when you think that there were thousands of building sites and hundreds of works over the country, we'd have had to have a very large organisation to do other than make spot checks on occasional firms.
But you have said that your staff, in a sense, had the occasional glimpse, and
yes.
What they saw
yes.
perturbed them. They
yes.
tell you passed that information on.
But as far as we're concerned, that might have been 1% or something like that. And we passed any information like that on to the ministry.
We asked the ministry if we could see those reports, not for our own benefit, but for that of councils, anxious to know how their blocks were built. The ministry acknowledged they had the files, but said they were still secret. But in terms of imposing some kind of...
Oh, well, that's all right then. It's a secret. I love the way the government could just do that. Oh, it's a secret, mate. I can't tell you.
Standard nationally, you had no power.
None at all.
It seems to me that when one does get a situation like this, a situation like Roland Point, a situation like the buildings in Nottingham, like that large building complex in Leeds, which had to be blown down, then one is led to a conclusion that there is something suspect. This is obvious. And as a result, it seems to me that it would be silly not to have an investigation, fundamental investigation, followed up by possibly detailed investigation on a national scale of all building systems, precast.
I just thought I'd mention, you mentioned Ronan Point.
Yeah, that's
Wasn't that the one that was like up for like 2 months or something? Or like it literally like collapsed after like a
No, well, yeah, there was an incident. It's going to come up very shortly. Actually, he'll explain what happened.
Oh, right, okay.
It was kind of a disaster. Yeah.
Building systems that have been used for this sort of thing.
How urgently should that investigation
Well, it should be done now. This is a matter of an immediacy, I think.
The system building boom lasted for 10 years. During that time, more than 750,000 flats were erected. Many of the contractors have since gone out of business. Others are involved in a welter of protracted lawsuits. Those that have been settled out of court. That way, there is no publicity. Fashion in housing has moved on, but more than 2.5 million people have no choice but to go on living in system-built blocks, whose structural safety must now be regarded as questionable. While it is not justified to say that every block is dangerous, neither is it possible for any local authority to say that all their blocks are safe. They simply do not have the means of proving it.
A house of cards, a tower of dominoes. There's a frightening accuracy in those descriptions provoked by the shock of Canning.
5 people died in the collapse caused by the 1968 explosion at Ronan Point. The government...
Oh, here we are, Simon.
So inquiry set up after the disaster recommended that gas should be removed from all system-built blocks.
And the new electrical appliances were brought in.
After 16 years of rapidly increasing fuel bills, many tenants cannot afford electricity and are throwing out those appliances. They're turning back to gas in the form of portable propane or colour gas cylinders.
In my opinion, it's like bringing in a bomb into the building, because there's no way in which any of these buildings, not just this system, but any system build construction, can resist an explosion from a colour gas type cylinder blowing up. And if they're mishandled or badly handled, then that's always a possibility. I don't want to create alarm, but it is a dangerous material to have in a building of this kind, or in any kind of building like this.
I mean, that is essentially what happened there, that people were using, gas appliances in buildings. Like sometimes you were using like colour gas tanks and things like that. But in that particular case at Ronan Point, what happened was there was a lady up on the 18th floor in one of the corner flats, and she went to her kitchen early in the morning just to light the gas stove to have a cup of tea. And because of a faulty seal, it blew out the outer wall of her kitchen. And because of that, that withdrew the support for the 4 floors above, and so all of those flats then just collapsed right down the side of the building.
I just had a quick glance at the Wikipedia page for this, and it said that probably more people would have been killed, but it happened very early when people were in bed, whereas the rooms that collapsed were mostly kitchen or living rooms or whatever. Otherwise, maybe everyone people on each floor might have been killed. I see this is Canning Town. This is in Canning Town, right? That's in the East End of London. This apparently was one of the buildings that people were moved out of West Ham, like slum or destroyed housing in West Ham, into newer builds like this. And then this is what happens.
I have to say, this guy is not doing the whole British people have bad teeth argument much many favours, because he has got a terrible pair of teeth.
Where extensive damage could be caused, not just to the walls and the floors, but to possibly create a similar kind of situation to Ronan Point, possibly.
So in fact, having those sort of cylinders in flats like this is potentially lethal?
I believe it is potentially lethal.
And why spend all the money if they're all right?
I mean, potentially lethal, look at it.
And the risk of fire going from one flat to another.
Well, they can't be safe.
We're concerned about them falling down, not fire. Yes, because all they would do was covering them.
A meeting of worried tenants in Hammersmith, West London. Hammersmith housing officials, like their counterparts throughout Britain, are faced with an insoluble dilemma. Privately, they know that their tenants are at risk, but publicly, they have to try to defend the decision to leave them in their tower blocks.
Just tell me one thing. When you've done this work, will you put your pen to paper and tell me that these flats are completely safe?
I think it would be a very brave man who would be prepared to say that something was going to be safe for a longer period than 20 years.
Why?
Because who knows?
Why are you wasting your money doing the work then? Because if they're not going to be safe, I don't want to live in them with my family.
When I first built, everybody thought they were absolutely safe for the 60-year period. Shortly after they were built, Ronan Point fell down, so we went and had another look, and then we said they were going to be safe for 60 years after we did the strengthening. We've found these problems which we never expected.
So,
Pause.
I mean, I can't say that.
So how would I'm just looking at the demographics here. I feel like I have to say something, because how would that in these areas of London? How would that go today? Because maybe you're gonna have 30 different nationalities, ethnic groups, religions, all in that one room. So who is going to be the local town planner? Who's going to be the one in charge of the building? Who's going to be the political representative? And then how are all the people going to have any kind of shared identity in? I just don't understand how that works.
Well,
When
I
you see,
mean, it's literally Grenfell, isn't it? I mean, literally what happened was Grenfell.
Well, that will come on to that, but I just mean in terms of a local town planning kind of thing like this. How does that when you've got maybe people all speaking different languages? Is it that the man, the chubby fella in the middle, is he going to be from Bangladesh? And then there's going to be 20 people from Somalia, 10 Poles. And are they going to be able to organize it themselves in that way? I would love to know, because this is the reality of London now. I don't.
That exact problem did arise in Tower Hamlets in the East End, and apparently they did start having separate meetings. But that was only two communities. That was British and Bangladeshi. That was it. I think all the Jews had moved out by then. It was just they started having completely separate processes for people to talk to the authorities in two different languages.
You see, in my imagination, some guardian do good sends a human rights lawyer with them, right? Some well-spoken white girl basically to do their speaking on their behalf. But that's only in my imagination. Maybe that doesn't actually happen, but that's what I mean. That's what it felt like. What happened when there was the fallout from Grenfell? It very quickly became something for the Guardian crowd to get behind. All the talking heads you saw weren't, I mean, they were like, oh yeah, here's one of the residents, and it was some Somalian or whatever, but all of the people on the shows were Guardian types, weren't they?
I'm guessing a meeting like this wouldn't happen now. They'd send out they'd send out consultants to each different community in private, probably.
Online process, meetings held in camera. I suspect it sort of wouldn't happen. That they would expose themselves to the anger that people might have in a situation like this.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good point. Do these sorts of meetings happen in white areas now, though? Today in 2025, or is it the same thing?
I know of a thing that went on in the Northeast, which was a planning thing, and there was a lot of stuff like this. And this is 3 years ago, and there was quite a bit of stuff like this went on. I popped along to have a look because I was interested to see. It was about a field that was going to be turned into something or other. And it was a nice stretch of land, and people like to walk their dogs there. It had paths at the side of it and stuff, and that was for the chop. And so I went along because obviously I was interested, and I wanted to see how it worked at the local level. And it was quite like this, to be honest, except everybody was standing up, and there was boards and stuff of the planning and where things were going to vehicle access and all of that. I mean, but you do see this in, the kind of meetings when you see the clips of Jess Phillips in these boroughs in Birmingham and stuff like that. And it looks kind of brutal, to be honest. It looks rough. I couldn't since Labour came back, you see that a lot more than what you do with the Tories.
I know how it happens in some of the Muslim areas, because I did that video a couple of in those areas. So in that meeting with Jess Phillips, for example, or Angela Rayner, or any of these types who've got a lot of ethnic diversity in there, a lot of Muslims in their seats. I believe that their communities are kind of quite hierarchical. So there is one spokesman. It's he is the community leader, and he will speak for the people type thing. So it tends to be quite. I mean, I don't know if you remember the one with Jess Phillips. They were all men, for example. Right. Well, women do live in that seat, but they were the
talking about
community,
there is
quote unquote community leaders. But go on, Horace.
that is apparently where the word multiculturalism first came from. I think to refer to things like that, like you acknowledging that there are separate communities and one person or one small elite speaks for each group. And we're talking about ethnic groups, right? So yeah, like the Bangladeshis will have a community leader, and the politicians just choose to work with that leader, and obviously take block votes from that leader as well. Literally votes in sacks.
That's how Sadiq Khan keeps on getting in. You know,
Right,
I'll give you a bunch of money. You give me 2,000 votes. You know,
and I think they originated the concept of multiculturalism because there's no other way to operate. You'd either have to expel those people from the country, or you deal with it in this way. They will not deal with you as individuals. The women won't speak to you. The kids won't, and whatever. Like, you have to speak to community leader. So they came up with this term to say this is how we're dealing with things now. And later it became an ideological doctrine. But at first it was just an acknowledgement of like, this is how we do things like planning. Yeah, we speak to each community leadership separately.
And just to speak to what Morgoth was saying, my suspicion is the meetings you're talking about a pre-project public consultations. That I can imagine still can happen. But anything which is like a post-tragedy remediation session like this, I suspect that might be more managed now in the same way that policing is designed to prevent, conflictual scenes happening between groups. I suspect this would be kind of parsed by councils, on grounds of, public strength of public feeling, safety. I don't know how much of this happened after Grenfell. Maybe that's why there was such a public campaign and such an anger about it that, you may have select representatives of the public invited to an in-camera meeting with councillors. But this sort of notion now, I mean, with something like Grenfell, people get torn apart.
Well, the Grenfell thing was seized upon immediately, like on the day, by the race relations industry, or whatever they're called now, right? They got in on that. And I think the day after it happened, Theresa May made a public statement. She was Prime Minister at the time, and saying, everyone in that building who was here illegally has no fear of being deported. Like, don't worry, you've got amnesty. And things like that. That's obviously like the Prime Minister, who's not even particularly responsible for housing or London or anything, just felt the need, I think the day after it happened, to say, yeah, you're all exonerated for any migration matters, so that they could speak freely or whatever, right? But it was like that just shows that who controls the process of reviewing these things or deciding what will have an inquiry, just the immediate response. It's the same old people who created, the Runnymede Trust and the Institute of Race Relations and all this. This is what it's all about.
I remember Scrump doing a really interesting stream on Grenfell before, because one of the things that those two do, Scrump and Evelyn, is that they always go back to a story after it's gone out to the public eye, right? I.e., Grenfell was a story for like 3 weeks or something, but then what happened afterwards, right? If you can find that stream, it's a pretty interesting one to go back and look on, because so many of those things that happen in the moment, it's like, where do they actually go? What actually happens after that? It's a question that very few people like who goes back and looks at Grenfell now type thing, So it's kind of anyway. There's probably about a quarter of this left, so
we won't find more problems that we don't expect now. We know a lot more now about these buildings than we did 20 years ago.
Well, who's going to make this decision? How does this message get back that some of us want out? Who takes the message back? You, Dinah?
Some of us just
To who?
enough. We can't stand them coming in once more.
The housing policy is that you put in for a transfer request.
Yeah, but they
I cannot turn round and say you can.
We know you
I
can't.
really like you. I think you're a frightfully nice girl. I'm going to put you in another nice little acquired property.
Yeah.
Do you think I can do that?
Either these people are taken out of there while the work's done and a complete survey is done of the whole block, or we admit the mistake that was made and pull them down and bring back the avenues. They were downsized.
You see, the other element of this that we haven't really talked about is that presumably all of these people are in social housing, right? This is literally like the government giving you a house. Is that what is happening here?
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like one of those weird things, because to my mind, it's like, well, the government never gives me anything. It's like on the one hand, yeah, okay, they've given you like a really shit place or whatever. On the other hand, you're literally just been given a house, which always like as a concept kind of blows my mind that you're just like given a place to live by the government.
Well, it's per what that guy was saying about, bring back the avenues. I mean, this is the point that Morrissey's always making about, when the streets were demolished, and they gave them the streets in the sky, they sort of, I guess, were obliged at a social level to provide them with some sort of accommodation, substandard though it proved to be, in an economic circumstance where they didn't have the control about the redevelopment to begin with.
The two books I read recently, they're by leftists. Like, it's not, they're not our friends or anything. But the New East End was one of them, and the previous one was Family and Kinship, right? And they are about all this. They do address this is all social housing, right? This is all people staying. Your existing house is going to be removed or whatever, so you're moving into this. That's what we're offering you, or obviously you can try and fend for yourself. But yeah, virtually this whole issue is all about social housing. And one thing, unfortunately, Curtis and the book I read didn't go into it that much, but made a few mentions of what came before this, how people came to be in social housing in the first place, because they weren't all naturally necessarily destitute, and weren't given it necessarily for that reason. And how, the other thing was that in the East End, at least, people lived within walking distance of each other, of their families, like when they moved out as adults. And they were actually, it was like quite a personal system of social housing. Like some of it was provided by, it was private housing, but contracted out to the state, right? Hired out by the state and then assigned to a social housing tenant. And everything was figured out to help you stay within walking distance of your family and stuff. And to, you stay in a very close locale, like a few hundred yards or whatever. And with the aim of obviously not breaking up families. But then in the 50s, 60s, things changed to, there was a lot of change. I'm sure you don't want loads of detail, but two major changes was, one was just like feminists and other theorists came in. They wanted to free women from men. So they started giving, right, so they pressured for the rules to be changed. I'm not sure exactly how it worked, but also the idea of need over other criteria came in. That's how Bangladeshis started all getting housed in the East End as well, because they arrived with nothing. And those two changes made everything completely different. It was now just, your units, we need to house a certain number of people. Then, it's just about numbers, right? Doesn't really matter where, doesn't matter how it affects your family, whether you can see your mum, whether your mum can look after the kids anymore, and all this. All that was just forgotten about. A whole new principle took over. But sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but yeah, this is all a social housing thing. That's why they're saying, where are you going to put me? You put me here, where are you going to put me next?
I was just looking up, apparently still over 80% of social housing is for white British. And of a total proportion, 16% of the white population live in social housing, even today. Which is a bigger number than I would have thought, to be honest. But yeah,
that first figure can't be right. That must be some misdefinition or something.
That's the
only about 70% of the whole population is British people now.
The percent of the latest things. The percentage of social housing residents who are white British is 77.6%. In new
Have they redefined social housing though?
Yeah, I don't know. That's the latest numbers I got here. So,
because I wonder, because if it's a private house but the state is paying for the person to live in it, does that count as social housing? Maybe not, because that's going to be the new thing with these, with asylum seekers and stuff. They're going to be placed by Serco, but it's private landlords, right? You heard about this? There's this famous map of the country where they're all going to be placed. I think that's private housing that's being used for that. So I don't know whether that counts as social housing, things like this. So I'm just dubious about that stat. Almost all the Bangladeshis who moved into Britain in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, almost all of them were given social housing in Tower Hamlets as one example. So
interesting. I wonder how many of those ones though ended up buying their council house under Thatcher.
Well, there's that as well, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the headline figure in London at the moment is 47% of social housing, is inhabited by new arrivals.
Yeah, but that's London as opposed to the whole country.
Just London, yeah.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's carry on.
But the avenues are beginning to have their problems too. As if coping with the problems of the 60s boom was not enough, councils are now finding trouble with the legacies of earlier housing crises. Over 500,000 non-traditional houses were built in the 40s and 50s. All were systems using concrete, which is now starting to rot.
Leeds has a quite extraordinary problem in that it has a large number of system-built houses. Perhaps if I show you examples of the ones that we have. Waller houses, we have 500 of those. Duo houses, 800. Waits houses, 1,016. Unity houses, 273. Rima houses, 1,499. Livette Cartwright, 2,882. Cornish units, 327.
There's problems with all of those houses, all of those types?
Yes, to varying degrees. Some are only just starting to exhibit problems. Some, such as the areas, we have serious problems with.
But those ones we just saw, like winning the jackpot for the social housing, because presumably if you get one of those, you don't get a high rise.
Yeah, I grew up on a council estate in Off Tyneside, and it was red brick ones, and they were solid. They're all still there. Everybody, because what happened was, like say, like my family, my dad bought our house when Thatcher allowed it, and then they went off and got a new build, which is by this time like 30 odd years old. But my dad always says the new builds, like it's as if it's built of cardboard. He says the council house is much better, and those old council houses go for quite a bit now.
Well, where I live, sometimes when we walk to the rough, quote unquote, rough side of town, and I go with my missus who grew up in the area that around by Twickenham. She said, "Well, when I was growing up, this was the rough side of town. All of these used to be council houses here that you can see, and now those houses in Twickenham go for like 1.5 million, 2 million, and they're not rough areas anymore because they've all been sold off. They've all been privatized. I don't think I'm not sure if any of those areas are still council houses. So it's kind of funny because in terms of that town, it used to be like, oh, there's a rough side of town and a posh side of town, but that no longer seems to be the case, even though people hold on to their snobbishness for various different reasons. But yeah, I'm interested in how many areas are like that, where you have a former council estate, which is now just fairly nice houses, or not quite. Or, I mean, I say fairly nice. I've been in some of those houses. They're not only well built, they're pretty big as well, garden and all sorts of things.
Yeah. So some of the brick ones, as you say, Morgoth, that will be kind of durable kind of properties, and the ones he's talking about here are the kind of, again, concrete type prefabs, and there's about 30-40 odd models of these different kinds of ones. The thing to look out for if people are considering buying houses is some of these what they call non-standard construction houses. Now people can run into problems with mortgage lenders and insurers because of the potential nature of decay in the structures.
And we need to be moving quickly to do something with them and make them structurally sound.
We have problems on housing that was built in the 20s, the Boots, Bow Creek, Boswell houses of the 20s. We have problems in relationship to the houses built in the 30s. Not much happened during the 40s because of the war. Then we come to the 50s and the nightmares that exist with our concrete.
You know what I'm saying there, right? All of those houses that we were just talking about would have been built in the 30s or the 50s or whatever. But presumably, and I hate to get all Ludwig von Mises here, right? Or Thomas Sowell, but what he'd say is when you've bought your own council house like that, suddenly you have a self-interested monitor, i.e. the person who bought the house. So all of these problems that they're talking about that the council can't like kind of sort out in aggregate because there's too many of them or it's too much of a headache. Presumably individually, the people who bought those houses will have piecemeal fixed it, family by family, when Thatcher sold them all off. Was that a fair assumption, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Seems correct to me. Yeah. Why don't you want to be like Misesian about it?
Well, I mean, what I'm saying, I mean, I think it's a valid argument, though. I think it's you have nobody cares about your own house as much as you if you own your own house, right?
That's why Hopper said that monarchy is often better than democracy, because the king considers the realm his, and he cares about what it's still worth in 20 years' time, or 100 years. You know?
I mean, there are a lot of areas that were very run down at certain times in history that, since they were sold off or since people have bought them up, are actually now fetch. I mean, not just 2-3 million, but through the roof. Certain parts of London, Notting Hill, famously, Simon, was very run down at one point, and now you probably have to be a Russian billionaire to buy a house there. So
yeah, you go and look at that film Performance, the Nick Rogue film, that you could see Notting Hill kind of pre-gentrification.
Post and beam structures. The 60s are a disaster area as far as we are concerned here in Birmingham, with system-built housing, with lots and lots of concrete being used, inadequate insulation. Very real problems for our tenants who are living in these properties.
I do believe that there are blocks of flats that, if action is not taken speedily, will provide a major risk to the people who live in them in the future.
We know that in the 40s and 50s there were 500,000 dwellings built, but the figure for the 60s and 70s is probably between 750,000 and 1 million.
Is it possible to turn that into the number of people affected and say how many people are living in defective or potentially defective?
Yes, I should think the number of people that are living in defective or potentially defective dwellings is probably up to 6 million.
Can you put a cost of the total amount you'll be spending to remedy all these defects?
Yes, the estimated figure for Leeds City Council is £458 million.
And how much did you get last year from the government?
We got from the government less than £8 million to spend on capitalised repairs of the type we've talked about this morning.
So you need more than 50 times that amount?
We do.
What will happen if you don't get it?
Well, clearly buildings will become progressively unsafe, and we would have to vacate certain properties and either board them up or demolish them.
this was like a major industrial scale fuck up by the British government, wasn't it? It really was.
Just the amount of money quoted there for remedial works, you know.
I see there's a sort of classic bit of Curtis sleeping in here with that violin song, and you're seeing all the disuse. I feel like I'm in a proper Adam Curtis documentary in this bit.
Yeah, it's a Britten violin concerto he's using there.
With no alternative accommodation, many councils are desperately trying to remedy the defects in their system-built housing stock so that their tenants can go on living in them. A new industry has sprung up, offering methods of repairing the systems.
I'm really curious now, Simon, as to how much footage exists of people living in these like squalid places. I'd love to just kind of, if you've got any.
Yeah, a few people have sent sort of interesting docos or clips of docos for sort of interviews with residents, but actual footage of interior living, I haven't come across an awful lot.
I want to see someone living in the maggot house, you know, with a damp down the walls. And
I can't remember where I saw it, but I saw a bit of footage of that, of a woman with a baby, like a baby in arms, and she said, "I cannot put him down because the carpet's all wet everywhere, the whole flat. I can't put him down. Can't put my baby on the floor."
Yeah, you certainly see it dramatised in our friends in the north.
It's brilliant.
I'd also like to see people living in the pre-system building slum dwellings that they all built, that they all knocked down as well. I've seen them. I've watched them being knocked down in that Nick Broomfield documentary, but I've not seen anyone like actually living in them, other than kind of in some of those kitchen sink dramas in the 50s, where they're, you know, like the house in Look Back in Anger, for example, right? I mean, some of these sorts of, I'd imagine some of those things are set in those old buildings that were knocked down in the 60s.
I was just going to say before as well, like some of the older housing that came before this, in the northeast, the housing was owned by the coal board. So I did a grok. It says, for example, the Ashington Coal Company constructed over 3,000 back-to-back miners' terraces in Ashington, starting in 1857, creating what was known as the world's largest mining business. So basically, it was a sort of feudalist system where the coal board would also own your house, and that went right up until the point that we've been talking about here.
It's a bit like Bourneville with Cadbury's, isn't it?
In the valleys where my mum is from in Wales, lots of those sorts of houses are still there, and they're remarkable to see because you know the mountain is like almost like a kind of clip. You know, it's like you're climbing up, so it's a really pretty big gradient on it, but the houses go all the way up the hill. You know, so they're kind of like they're right on top of each other, these little houses, and they're all still there. The people still live in them to this day, the old mining families and so on. So, yeah.
Tower blocks hundreds of feet high are being completely recovered or reclad in new materials, guaranteed to prevent rain reaching the joints. When the housing department dealing with the Trowbridge estate in London were trying to solve the problem of water leakage, they were offered 4 different commercial systems to choose from. Can you tell me what happened when you tested the systems that had been suggested for use at Trowbridge?
Well, in that case, the criterion was quite simply that the system would prevent rainwater crossing a small cavity and wetting the insulation, which was to be fixed on the outside of the blocks.
So, sorry to interrupt him again. What I'm hoping is, right, is that somebody had an early VCR camera in like 1986 or something like that, so that we actually got to see inside these things just before they were knocked down in the late 80s. You know, that would be the ideal footage I'd like to find.
And to our surprise, none of the systems tested succeeded in doing this.
Did the systems fail the test badly?
Some of them did, some failed very badly, but some were not so bad. They failed comparatively narrowly, but it would have been important. We were dealing with a 3-meter square panel. If you consider that area grossed up to the size of a high-rise block, then obviously it's serious enough.
Are those?
This guy here could almost be a character from Clockwork Orange, couldn't he? one of those guys, or one of the prison guards or something.
Systems being used by other local authorities?
Well, so far as I know, yes, but whether they're being used in precisely the same form, I have no way of telling.
The only way that you can repair the present industrialized systems, or virtually the only way, is by the use of other untried and untested remedial works. And so we're actually finding that there are now systems of repair coming in to repair the systems-built dwellings in the first place. And we already have evidence of some of those repair systems failing because they've been inadequately researched and evaluated.
What sort of risks do you think there are from using systems that haven't been appraised properly?
Well, to take a very obvious one, there's the fire risk, and I think it's absolutely essential that anything that is being placed on or around an existing block should be considered very carefully in relation to a serious fire. There's the problem of weather tightness that we've already mentioned, where if water is dripping inside a system for years, it may make the situation much worse than it ever was before the cladding was placed.
On the question of a fire risk, do you think that there are now systems being used which represent a fire risk?
Frankly, yes.
Would you be prepared to name them?
No.
When professionals now tell us that the remedial work...
Yeah.
The good news, you're not going to have any more damp. The bad news, you're going to be incinerated.
Being done on high-rise blocks is adequate and will solve the problem. Should we trust them?
If I say yes, will you call me complacent? I would take everything they say with a pinch of salt.
It's very difficult to, as an amateur,
my job is to look after tenants and manage housing. I'm not an engineer or a surveyor. It's difficult as an amateur to criticise professionals, but the only way I can respond to the question is to say that the calming and impressive manner of these well-heeled professionals who argue that these buildings are safe or can be made safe is exactly the same kind of information and argument that was put by the very people who designed them in the first place. Those people, those experts, built these buildings that have now been shown to warrant £33 million worth of repairs. That's £33 million worth of a professional mistake. And the cost of that has to be met because the builder went bankrupt and the professionals responsible can't be nailed for it. The cost of that has to be found by ratepayers and rent payers. And rent payers in this borough are ratepayers too. And the cost falls back on the tenants. And on this estate, a large number of the tenants are unwaged, below the poverty line, and elderly people. And if you're asking me to accept the word of people that built this rubbish and to accept their arguments for remedial works and to say that because they're professionals I must believe it, I'm asking you to believe me that a £33 million mistake is evidence for the amateur to argue that you reject the so-called professional arguments, you listen to the tenants, you look with your own eyes, and you use the evidence of those observations and the horror stories that people tell you of the problems they've had with flooding and defects and deficiencies, and you are guided by them and not by so-called professionals who, frankly, I don't believe have a clue about what they're doing here.
Okay, that whole spiel by that guy, I made that video on Carlisle yesterday. It reminded me of an essay that he's got called Statistics, where he basically walks through London, Victorian London, and being like, yeah, you know, I've seen a kid with one leg and, you know, people like begging in the street and, yeah, but don't believe your lying eyes, you know, everything's going great here. It's just kind of, it's the same old story, really.
So it leaves us with the foreshadowing of Grenfell, which was once that because the cladding was going to go up. And I get the impression, like, because I remember when that happened, and the left just in Britain just went crazy. They just went wild. Well, I mean, it was a bad disaster. It was a tragedy and everything. But I also now, having watched this, I get the feeling that maybe it was because a lot of them had spent decades campaigning on the, you know, like these old-fashioned leftist issues of social housing problems and stuff. And then on top of that, you had the double up effect where it was full of minorities. So you got this kind of hitting the, you know, like the one-armed bandit where all the cherries were lining up. And so that's what Grenfell became for them, where they could say, we told you this for years. I even think they managed to somehow get dodgy dealing Tories who involved with it all as well, who are responsible for it. So it was kind of like a perfect sort of thing for the left to go in on, and I didn't realize it till I watched this.
Yeah, and they're gonna demolish it now, aren't they, Grenfell? I think Rayner said that a couple of months ago. So.
Yeah, but they'll build an even bigger monument to Grenfell right outside Parliament next to the Holocaust one.
Yeah. There's a sort of summary from a blog called Architizer here, which just rounds off this particular film. It says, what emerges is a story about incentives in this Adam Curtis film. While the dream of widely available social housing was noble, the incentive structure in the 1960s encouraged cheap construction with little oversight, leading to junky buildings that ended up discrediting the notion of council houses in the minds of millions of Britons. The stigma itself attached to brutalist design too, as this misunderstood, frankly utopian style of building came to be associated with the grifters who accepted government money but failed to deliver functional housing. And there's a last comment from an MP in Nottingham called Alan Simpson. He wrote a book called Stacking the Decks, which was about housing policies back in 1981. And he said about this sort of form of building, he quoted an architect who said, concrete is a fine material for a place like Brasilia, where it sparkles in the sun. but it can be pretty miserable in Basford on a wet November day. And there's no doubt about it, concrete as we used it brings out the savagery in kids.
I think I disagree with the first one's take on it. I don't think it was utopian. I think it's really grubby and low. And
no, he's talking about brutalist design as a utopian concept. I mean, it's a sort of, it's abstracted from the actual living experience of being in a a sort of an apogee of brutalist building. I mean, brutalism was just a kind of a mode of doing it, and it was kind of like an IKEA cut price version of it as well. As a concept, it's more of an abstract and artistic kind of study.
They also said that it was. They also sort of separated the motives from the reality. Though they said it was like the system building, social housing and stuff was a known blame. It's like, well, why consider the aim in isolation? I mean, the aim was the aim that people like Richard Crossland and Keith Joseph had, which was to fill up quotas. It says more to me about things that being directed from the top. I mean, I know I sound like a drumbeating libertarian, but this is what happens when you have state planning in charge of what things that should be human.
And that was true. We covered that in The Trap, where I remember mentioning that the targets thing that people thought came in under New Labour did actually start with building in councils, in the 60s.
Probably started with the war, right? Probably started with the First World War, really. I mean, I won't go into that, but a lot of planning and the sort of brutality of the way that the state treats people it claims to be looking after, I think really derives from the First World War and then the Second as well. The idea of just sweeping away the old to fulfill some new plan. Anyway, I'll go off my hobby horse, so I won't go into it.
I remember when I was looking into brutalism before, because I started getting interested in the high rises around London and taking pictures of them, and then looking up, trying to find information about who designed this building, when was it built, and all this sort of stuff. And I kept on coming back to this Hungarian architect called Erno Goldfinger.
Oh yeah, Trellick Tower. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not a movie baddie. That's a real person.
Like a real guy called Erno Goldfinger.
Yeah.
Hungarian of a particular extraction, if you really must know. And I kept on coming back to him. I think he designed quite a few other ones that are still around, like that Trellick Tower, like you mentioned, and a few other ones as well that are still there. I think they may even be listed now.
Quite prestigious to live in them. I saw people refurbing them back, 20 years ago, and doing all sorts of, 60s kind of original features back in them and selling them off, later for quite a bit of money. It's that kind of London sort of, hipster cultural class that love all that stuff and love wanting to, inhabit those kinds of spaces where they get a bit of a taste. It's sort of a taste of elite modernism, which is, like I say, brutalism is interesting if you look at well-designed buildings. But again, this is the difference between mass housing and, particular examples. That's the one.
Here's the Trellick. Now, do you remember what we were saying? Do you see those little corridors there? Presumably that's a lift. Is it on the left?
Yeah, lift shaft, presumably.
Yeah. No,
that's the Grade 1 listed building. That's Grade 1.
Those corridors were put there by the architect to kind of recreate, how in old-fashioned streets you talk to your neighbor across the fence, or you'd see them in the street or whatever. So they deliberately put these corridors there so that people would kind of have a communal feeling in those corridors. That's why that's what Nick Broomfield talks about in the Who Cares documentary. Is that so? I don't know if
the idea of streets in the sky. I mean, one of the things that people have pointed out, one of the deficiencies, of course, unlike sort of streets actually on the ground, of course, is it presents a massive policing problem. There are no police on the streets in the sky.
Police in the sky. Voila! There you go.
Jonathan Meads. On the Jonathan Meads documentary, he tries to get people. His point is that from the perspective of, I think it was 2010 or something, that documentary was done, but whatever later. And his point is that we are now kind of programmed to view brutalism and buildings like that with contempt. And he says, if you could just go back and imagine the wonder of it all when it was first built, and so and he if you can just kind of get over that, and he waxes lyrical, and he has like a bit of spiel where he says, just in his own kind of cut way, and it's like, can you just imagine what it was like before the walkway in the sky had seen its first stabbing and the lift had seen its first piss? Before the lifts were pissed in, and before anybody had been stabbed on the skywalk.
In a typical bougie way, as Simon is suggesting, this Trellick Tower, has become it's become like kind of the preserve of people who have apartments like this now.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, it's got a different type of clientele. So presumably they're not stabbing each other in the corridors, but it's just like, well, they've replaced social housing with luxury apartments.
That's one of the ones I think I saw in this report on the news years ago. This couple had bought this place and they were doing it up. They took one whole wall and sheeted it in pure copper, as a kind of feature wall.
Copper? That'd be quite expensive.
Copper. Yes, it would be. Yeah, this is, as I said, it was about 20 years ago when people started to take these places, do them up, handpick all the kind of, 60s furniture. I mean, you like some of that sort of modernist furniture as well. And some of it can be very stylish. And if it's very well made, high end stuff, that can be quite nice. And people kind of kit out the apartments in that mode. Yeah.
I mean, just viewed out in a different light. You could see, well, look, you've got an amazing view of London there. You can there is a different way of looking at it, but you've kind of stripped out the soul of the thing because it was meant to be social housing, not for rich Ponzi twats, basically.
Yeah, and it's not the reality of living with your Formica table and your water running down the walls and having to have electricity to heat yourself.
That's just the kind of London high-rise version of that area in Brooklyn. Dumbo, New York, or whatever is now really shishy and so on. Yeah, but it's not like, okay, you kick out Notorious B.I.G. and all his mates, right, or whatever, and suddenly Queens is quite a nice area. Oh well, lo and behold, you've replaced the population with, rich students or whoever it is, So
correcting the original mistake that brought them in. So
there are a couple of super chats, not too many, but I might as well hit them because we are at the 3-hour mark here. Port Film Co-op says accent challenge for Simon.
Oh, God.
Indian Douglas Murray.
Oh no, I can't. I just can't. I'm tired. I can't. I'm exorcising Douglas Murray. I can't do it.
Port Film.
You're not like a coin machine.
No, I'm trying to exercise him, but he keeps on doing more and more shows.
Yeah.
Port Film Co-op says in Australia, housing is getting worse because our richest man, Harry Triguboff, check early life, is a property developer who uses his influence to flood Australia with Indians to fill tower blocks. The thing is, right, Australia is basically unsettled. Like all of Western Australia is just like wild land. So why have they got a single tower block? You could just build horizontally forever for the next 100 years and still not run out of space in Australia.
Yeah, because of the mining boom in the early 2000s, they built overbuilt in the way that I think it happened in Ireland when the so-called Celtic Tiger economy came. There was a lot of development, a lot of which has been left empty and unviable now.
Port Film Co-op says from the spoiled for choice era of the early 90s action cinema, seek out the underpan peak of craft, practical FX, and Verhoeven-esque media satire that is the masterwork Predator 2. Great sci-fi action. So there we go, Predator 2. Is that the one with Jesse Ventura in it, or is that Predator 1? I think that's Predator 1.
Danny Glover's in it.
Right, okay, I remember now. Okay. Seamus O'Blaine says, I knew an old man with a horse half door as a kid. Eyes That Watch says, Morgoth laments the loss of the Slag Hills. He ought to walk up to Big Market from Collingwood Street on a Saturday night. That's a hill, and it has lots of slags. He says,
I've done it many times. I walked that hill many times as a younger man, but we all move on.
And did you walk that hill in order to pick some goodness out of the slag heap?
Yeah, many a night. I mean, what I will say, besides the big market, which relates to the stream, is that I used to love, with a couple of friends, or me cousin as well, was during the daytime. Newcastle was just amazing. Like to go for a day's drinking, like on a Tuesday afternoon, to all of the shitty, grotty side bars over by the West End where you had all the high rises and stuff. And you'd have all these little grotty pubs, and all of you get all these colourful characters which would come into the bar, and they all came from these high rise things. They're still there, I think. I haven't been over that way for years, but they were still there at the time anyway. And you'd get like weird you'd get like men in their 50s dressed up in suits as if they'd been around, like wearing the same thing since 1940. But you could see like they were unshaven and they were alcoholics, and they'd have like a bottle of whiskey in a brown bag. There would be like, you'd get strange things. Like you'd have like a woman would come in drunk, but she'd have like, say, 3 whippets with her, and she'd sit with them all day in the pub. And it was just all these, because they were all social housing, they were all on the dole, they were all weirdos, and they'd come out, and the whole place, all these twisty back streets were full of pubs and people like this back in the day. I loved it. I loved to just sort of fritter the days away in places like that. And it all just got turned gay, and sad times. It all changed when Blair got in, because he showered Newcastle with loads and loads of money, and that's when you got all the neoliberal stuff popping up. And
did Newcastle get to be European city of culture at any time? That seems
I don't know. I didn't pay any attention, but it wasn't too long after Blair came in, because it was kind of like Blair really wanted to reward Newcastle. There was this. I mean, you saw with T. Dan Smith, there was this long thing on the left where we have to get Newcastle back. We have to bring it back somehow. It was a old obsession with the left that you saw with Smith. And Blair kind of did do that. Newcastle just got showered with money when Blair came in. Like, really, it just went wild. And we ended up getting, like, the Sage and the Millennium Bridge, and everything got cleaned up. And they jet washed all of the old coal suits and stuff came off the walls. And it was like, yeah, you're shiny and you're new and it's hip. And lots of people from the south started to come up. And the new nightclubs came, and it was all glass and steel. And I moved away anyway to the continent not long after. I think that was why I'm rambling on a bit here, but I think that's why I got such a culture shock when I came back for holidays, because there was long gaps between, and I could see the changes.
You get the more sort of the more, I don't know, maybe Dinos, but like Geordie Shore sort of people as well, like. Those sort of people come to the fore culturally, like in the pop culture, right?
Yeah,
and it begins to make you more generic, basically, and more, everything's just about the same as everywhere else in the country. I had a question for you. Sorry, Bob, just about T. Dan Smith. Just when you made when I think it was when Jack Charlton or Bobby Charlton died, you did a video and you said that you felt some affinity with them. I think and there was a sort of maybe a biological, what do you call it, a phenotype that they seem to fit of the Northeast. Did T. Dan Smith have that at all?
He does a bit, actually, to be honest. He does a bit. He looks a bit like my grandfather, to be honest. But yeah, there was that, and it was as if the Jack Charlton type was in the social clubs and in those backstreet bars in Newcastle and all that. And I felt that in the late 90s and then into the 2000s, it just all got squeezed out. I mean, Jack Charlton was still drinking in Ashington Social Club until he died. Like, you could go to Ashington Social Club and Jack Charlton would be sitting in the corner with a bunch of old miners having a pint, like, up to his last days.
Who's a world famous player as well.
Yeah, it was strange because he had this amazing life and he became like a sort of saint and island and everything. And then he ended his days back in, so obviously he was very wealthy, but he ended his days back in Ashington Social Club, just sitting having a pint of Guinness or bitter with his old mates back where it all began. Good laugh at the bar.
Yeah, just before I do the next super chat, you're talking about Western Australia. There are some people there were saying it's just desert. I mean,
yeah.
Look, it's not just desert. It really isn't. Just have a look. Right, look at that there. If that was in California or Arizona, that would be a suburb. I guarantee you that would be a suburb. Or, I mean, you're not thinking like, do you remember that film we watched years ago? I can't remember the name of it now. You're not thinking like that guy who was like, look, as far as you can see, that could be a McDonald's. That could be a high-rise car park. Over there, that could be something else. It's basically unsettled. Look.
Yeah.
You're telling me you couldn't build housing there? You could.
I suspect some of that first shot was probably in the Pilbara, where it's a big bauxite mining area. And some of the other stuff is possibly further down south. I don't know. It could be the sort of around the sort of Margaret River towards South Australia area.
Easily
but I mean,
live in these areas.
Yeah, but they're just so far from everywhere in terms of infrastructure. I mean, the cities are very spread out thinly along the coast. So you
Picture the
need
scene.
to have
Look,
yeah,
Grenfell Tower there. You know. All right. Crispy GT says, a great set of hosts. Thank you for this series. Well, thank you very much, sir. Juno says, habitat modification has detectable effects on genetic markers generations down the line. Globalization is a form of ethnic cleansing. He also says, architecture as reaction by man to his environment. Matt 716, by their fruit you will recognize them. This is the habitat our fathers created for us. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that interests me is how this experiment with the high rises didn't seem to last long. They all like fell down or were demolished, or like lots of the stuff that was built isn't there anymore. Or, you know, as we've seen, new arrivals have been shunted into them. My understanding is that similar housing that was built in the East Bloc, in the Soviet Union, in like Czechoslovakia, or all of anywhere east of the Iron Curtain, Germany, East Germany. My understanding is that it's all still there, or that many of those buildings that they built have survived or didn't have these issues. Is that?
Yeah, I've had a friend yesterday who's out in, gosh, I can't remember where he said. I think he might have said Kyrgyzstan or something like that. But he said the Soviet build quality actually is pretty durable, and actually the apartment he was living in was quite nice. I mean, I always think of those kinds of weird Soviet apartments you always see with the kind of very dated kind of decor, and they look kind of sort of cramped, but you know, apparently some of them are all right.
What about that, Horace? Suck on that, Von Mises.
Well, I suppose I'd be completely contradicting what I said earlier about, you know, state planning and stuff. But you could say in a way the Soviet Union functioned a bit like a monarchy in that they needed to care what people still thought of the same regime 10 or 20 years later, so they didn't want bits of buildings falling off. But I am contradicting myself by saying that. So.
Jay says, live stream the trip to Newcastle. I mean, Simon will tell you, I'm always big talking meetups, but I'm a very long-housed individual at the moment. So
I will
definitely do it. I have a dream. We're going to meet up for a pint, and then we're going to plan a trip to that Brutalist thing before June.
There was that, when we were talking earlier, Morgan and I were talking about Killingworth, and I was disappointed that it had been, they were doing a sort of tour thing this year, and I thought it was actually of Killingworth, but Killingworth apparently is being flattened, and so they were just doing the local area now to sort of give you a bit of a sense of the story. But I think it would be incredibly interesting to be able to see what that stuff was like.
It's just a giant Morrison's now. I mean, and this was a video that I did.
Spires of Morrison's.
Yeah, I mean, I remember because as they were knocking down the big blocks and everything, the Morrisons appeared, and it was the first time I'd seen like the new giant sort of supermarket, superstore type deal. When I was just a little kid, like, but I remember the big thing was that they had French stick bread, which nobody'd seen before, and you know what I mean. And it had like the Morrison's black and yellow kind of logo, and it was all glass, and it tempted you in. They had round pizzas as well. I only knew the French stick ones, like the from Findus. But here you could get these big rounded pizzas with tuna on, and they were just delicious. And it was kind of tempting you in, you know what I mean? When we're knocking down, we're going to take out all that depressing concrete shite, and now we're going to lure you in with all of these neoliberal globalist goodies. Come on in. Oh, they had bags of donuts as well. And all of these were just luxury items that I'd never seen anything like it before. I was amazed. Everybody used to hang around Morrison's like it was this hip, cool place, and you know, and it was the first kind of thing. It was the first tempting you in. Oh, we may need to get some Polish people in, and you know, it's all about just what you consume. And little did I realize that, this is where you end up thinking, I just want the concrete back. Now that I know where it all headed, just give me back the slums.
I also find that the steel and the I mean, maybe on a future stream we can look at the steel and the glass as the neoliberal architectural style and what that says. I remember going to New York and meeting up with Radlib, and we visited the site, the One World Center, you know, that they've built on the site of 9/11. We walked around there. And they've built this it's like a kind of mall, and it's called the One World Center, and it's very, very kind of neoliberally, if that makes any sense. And I remember we got into the middle of it, and Radlib just turned to me and said something like, "I absolutely hate this place. It has no soul. This is like the worst place on earth." So that was that's something that. Like, when did that style come in? I associate the gherkin with it, you know, and the Shard in London. That's very much of that style, isn't it? But
it's almost of a piece with that Allegria design style. You know, the people of flat design, the sort of classic, you know, Globo Homo graphic design mode.
Well, there was a little period in the 90s where everything was pine, if you remember, like pine and like. They had like curved walls made out of natural wood and things, but then at some point they brought in the steel and the glass, and there's a lot of places. Like, in fact, looking at this Killingworth, this place that the Morrisons is in Killingworth, it looks very much steel and glass from what I can tell. So anyway,
Lloyd's of London building was an early sort of steel and glass structure. I think that's a famous one. 80s, mid-80s, that was.
Taking the inside and putting it outwards, I think, was the principle of that. So you've got all the pipe work and ducting on the outside of the building.
Yeah, so some of that goes back to the 80s.
Chris Bymer says, most of my formal education was in a building literally designed by prison architect. Good times. Ludwig von Lammy says, the conservative 1956 Housing Subsidiary Act subsidized flats in tower blocks to a much greater extent than houses, which ensured that they got built throughout Britain. High-rise buildings are much costlier to construct and maintain than low-rise buildings. They are much more complex projects in terms of engineering, logistics, and management. I can certainly believe that from what we were seeing. But it makes you wonder whether I know building houses brick by brick is slow work or whatever, but I wonder if they would have actually in the long run saved themselves money rather than trying to do it on the quote unquote cheap in the short term. It seems like they cost themselves a lot more money in the long term.
There's this documentary, I think it's probably still on YouTube. I Hate the 60s, and it's like kind of a bit sort of humorous, but like bad things that happened in the 60s. One of them is all this tower blocks and system building. And they do name some of the other problems that people had. It might have been there that I saw that clip of the woman who couldn't put her baby on the carpet, but People named also because there'd sometimes be what do you call it, like a little block of blocks, like 12 of them all in one place. They also create wind tunnels or like bizarre wind effects around and between the buildings because it's just wind it struggles to flow through a narrower space or whatever. And that's another thing. Like some people getting blown off their feet and stuff.
Josh Wesson says, "Great listen, chaps. Thank you, Simon. I hope you're well."
I am. Thank you. You too.
Jacek Kaminsky says, "And here I was thinking Soviet building etiquette sucked, and here we are now, where here we go. Superjednodovska, finished in 1970, is still standing strong, with over 1,000 people still living there." So there we go. You can look up that building if you want. Supernojevska. Coney says, "Speaking of modern concrete monstrosities, look up news of a Starbucks that just opened in Brownsville, Texas. It has been made from 3D printed concrete, which they've left exposed. It is pure slop in architectural form." Well, first of all, here's that building in Russia that he was talking about. That houses 1,000 people, apparently. There you go. Oh, beautiful brutalist design. And then what was the other one we were going to look up?
Brownsville,
Texas,
wasn't it?
Brownsville.
Was it a coffee shop or something?
Starbucks. Starbucks 3D printed. There you go. They've 3D printed a Starbucks, and it looks like that. It's the coffee giant's first 3D printed store. Look. So there we go. I still don't really understand what 3D printing is, I'm afraid. But
it's plastic. 3D printing produces plastic products.
Well, I'm sure that won't get hot in the summer. Sergio says, "Whittier, Alaska, has a building which houses most of the city's population, about 200, with a post office and a church, and connects by a tunnel to the school." So there's another strange building. I'll see if I can find that. Coney says, "This stream brings me to mind of J.G. Ballard's book High Rise, which I have not read." Dan Qua 111 says, "Australia, like London, etc., small flats purely for foreign cash parking. Better no tenants for capital retention. Tax better than losing it all."
Yeah.
And if you're interested in that building in Alaska, it looks like this. Apparently, there are the whole town lives in that one building. Look.
Oof.
There you go. It's been there for quite a while, apparently, too. So there we go. Well, it was a longer episode today, as I suspected it would, with the four of us on this topic. But just before we get out of here, Simon, where can people find you, sir?
I am at Simon__Roberts on Twitter. I'm just going to give a shout out and a shield to our friend Alexander Adams, artist. He's done an interesting article on in praise of brutalism. He's also got a new novel coming out, and that will be an event in London on the 28th of May. So do please check him out. I shall be retweeting him. Buy a ticket, go along, and maybe even discuss brutalism with him.
Horace, where can people find you, sir?
At Infinite Horus on Twitter and eternalhorus.substack.com.
Morgoth
Review here on YouTube and on Substack.
Cheers, it's starting to get hot now, isn't it? We all need to get out. It's starting to really heat up here at the lodge. I'm going to hit the road. It was a beautiful spring morning this morning, fresh spring morning. But
enjoy.
I think tomorrow is set to be the hottest day like ever or something in spring.
You can go outdoors and celebrate Trump's 100 days of common sense, as the BBC are calling it this day.
Oh yeah, I can't wait for that.
Yeah.
All right. Last minute one from Cringe Walker, who is into architecture. He says, have you ever seen the tower leaning 2 degrees in Manhattan that has now been abandoned? Quality first world engineering, he says. So there we go. Thank you very much for sticking with us, folks. And I'll see you all next Tuesday for office hours. There will be a video tomorrow morning featuring Black Horse on the Canadian election, where Carney Mania is running wild. So can't wait for that one.
What goes on in this town is none of your business.
As long as I'm living here, it is.
Then maybe you shouldn't be living here!
Well, that's easily fixed.